Audio review of textbook for Class 11. Political theory.
Welcome to your deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we are deep diving into Chapter 1, Introduction to Political Theory.
Right. Political theory. Sounds a bit heavy, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. You hear that and maybe think, dusty old books, complex arguments.
Stuff only academics care about.
But really stick with us because this chapter, it's about unpacking the basic ideas behind how societies actually work.
Yeah, like who gets to make the big decisions and why does any of that matter to, well, to you,
Yeah.
to us?
Right. We're looking at these fundamental questions people have been asking for, like, centuries.
And the surprising thing is how relevant they still are. Even if you think, oh, politics, that's just noise on TV.
Or worse, when you hear politics, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Is it, flattering?
Probably not, right? Often it's, manipulation, maybe scams,
Yeah.
people looking out only for themselves.
Yeah, that phrase, dirty politics. Or, like, you hear about a cricketer maybe manipulating team selection.
Or a student using, family connections to get ahead.
Or even just, like, a colleague sucking up to the boss. We call that playing politics, don't we?
And it's almost never a compliment when we say it that way.
So it's easy to see why lots of people just kind of switch off. They say, ugh, I am not interested in politics.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. Keep me out of it.
But here's the twist. It's kind of like saying you're not interested in, I don't know, the air you breathe.
Huh. Yeah, good analogy.
Yeah.
Because politics, in the broader sense, it's just how we organize ourselves,
Right.
how we live together.
Think about Mahatma Gandhi. He wasn't exactly shy with his words. He said politics envelops us like a snake.
A bit dramatic, maybe, but his point was solid. You can't really escape it.
Right, because any society, any group of people needs some way to make collective decisions to keep things running.
Exactly. And it's crucial to get beyond this idea that politics only happens in parliament or government offices.
Oh, definitely. Think about government policies, the economy, foreign relations, education. Huge stuff. And it hits you right where you live. Like, imagine there's some conflict. Suddenly, the market's shut.
Kids can't go to school. That's a direct impact.
Or, flip side, good policies. Maybe they lead to better jobs, improved literacy.
Those aren't just abstract theories. They're like the real-world consequences of political decisions.
And it's not just a one-way street, is it? It's not just government doing things to us.
No, absolutely not. It's also about how we, as citizens, get involved.
Yeah, think about people forming associations, maybe trying to improve the local park,
Or organizing campaigns for causes they believe in, negotiating with neighbors even.
protesting things they disagree with, debating what their representatives are doing.
All of that is part of the political process. You're trying to shape the world around you.
So, if we boil it all down, what's the essence of politics?
Well, it seems to arise because we all have different ideas, different visions about what's fair, what's just, what's desirable for society.
We don't all agree on the best way forward.
Exactly. So politics is the process, sometimes messy, sometimes frustrating, of negotiating those differences.
Making decisions together, both at the government level and, within society more broadly.
All, hopefully, with the aim of developing society, solving common problems.
Okay, so that's politics, the playing field. What about political theory, then? Is that like the official rule book?
Yeah, sort of. Political theory dives into the underlying values and principles, the why behind the rules.
Ah, okay.
Think about those really big words: democracy, freedom, equality.
The ones you hear thrown around all the time.
Right? Political theory unpacks what those actually mean. They're not just slogans. They're ideals that often get embedded in constitutions, like in the US or India.
The foundational documents, guiding principles.
Exactly. They're the standards we try, or at least say we try, to live up to.
And these big ideas, freedom, equality, they didn't just, fall out of the sky, did they?
Not at all. There's a whole history here. Political theory traces these ideas back.
To who? Ancient thinkers.
Yep. You've got folks like Kautilya in ancient India, Aristotle in Greece. They were already grappling with how best to govern.
Wow.
Way back then. And then you move forward through history. Rousseau talking about freedom, Marx focusing on equality,
Gandhi on Swaraj or self-rule.
and Bedkar on the rights of minorities. These thinkers, their ideas really shaped how we understand politics today.
So political theory isn't just reading old texts, it's understanding the evolution of these crucial ideas.
Precisely. It systematically examines the principles behind our constitutions, governments, social life.
Clarifying concepts like freedom, equality, justice.
Democracy, secularism. Even things like the rule of law, the idea that everyone's subject to the law,
Even the powerful people.
especially the powerful people, and separation of powers, making sure no one branch of government gets too much control.
Like checks and balances.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that some of the most influential thinkers, like Rousseau or Marx, weren't politicians themselves. Yeah, but their ideas profoundly influenced generations of politicians and activists. They provided a framework.
Okay, but let's bring it to today. Someone listening might think, fine, interesting history, but India's free, it's democratic. Is this theory stuff still, relevant now?
That's a super important question. And
Yeah.
the answer is a definite yes.
Why is that?
Because even in a democracy, these questions about freedom and equality are constantly alive. They don't just get solved and put away.
So they're not just abstract concepts in books.
Not at all. They play out every day. You might
Yeah.
have political equality on paper, one person, one vote.
Right.
But then you look around and see huge economic gaps or social discrimination based on caste or gender or religion.
So the ideal isn't always the reality for everyone.
Exactly. For many people, those promises of freedom and equality still feel pretty distant.
It's like, the basic rules of cricket, right? But how umpires interpret leg before wicket can change over time, or how they use technology reviews.
That's a brilliant analogy. It's just like that with constitutional rights.
How so?
Well, take the right to life.
Hmm.
The words in the Constitution might be the same, but courts have interpreted it much more broadly over time.
Include.
Things like the right to a livelihood, a basic standard of living. It's not just about not being killed.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
And think about the right to information. That wasn't explicitly there from the start, but it became recognized as essential for transparency. So a new law was made.
So the understanding evolves as society changes and faces new challenges.
Precisely. Technology is a huge example now. The internet, social media, amazing tools for activists, right? Connecting people globally.
Yeah, for human rights, environmental causes.
But the same tech can be used by criminals or for spreading misinformation.
True, double-edged sword.
And then online commerce raises huge questions about privacy. How much should companies know about us? What about government surveillance?
Unsolicited emails, targeted ads. Where do we draw the line?
These are all modern political theory questions. The core principles, freedom, privacy, security, need constant reevaluation in new contexts.
Got it. So this chapter, chapter 1, it's really setting the stage, focusing on where these core ideas, freedom, equality, citizenship, justice came from.
Exactly. Their origins, their meanings, and their significance today.
And the way political theory explores them is interesting, too. It's not always about finding one single right answer.
No, not like in math where 2 plus 2 is always 4. Political theory asks, what does equality really mean, and why does it matter?
And there can be multiple answers, depending on the situation.
Precisely. Unlike, say, defining a triangle, concepts like justice or freedom are complex. They have different facets, sometimes conflicting ones.
So how do theorists tackle that complexity? The chapter mentions Socrates.
Ah, Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher, often called the wisest man back then.
What was his deal?
He famously went around Athens questioning people, especially those who thought they knew it all, about their most basic beliefs, about justice, virtue, politics.
Sounds potentially annoying.
Huh. It was. He made powerful people uncomfortable by showing the flaws in their thinking. So uncomfortable, in fact. They've eventually sentenced him to death for corrupting the youth and impiety.
Yikes. Just for asking questions.
Pretty much. His student, Plato, wrote down many of these conversations and dialogues, like the Republic.
And what do these dialogues show?
They show Socrates' method, using relentless questioning and logic to expose inconsistencies in commonly held views.
Can you give an example, like with justice?
Sure. In one dialogue, he talks with a man named Cephalus. Cephalus suggests justice is simple, telling the truth and paying back your debts.
Seems reasonable enough, honest and responsible.
Seems so. But Socrates immediately throws a wrench in it. He asks, okay, what if a friend lends you weapons, then goes mad, asks for them back? Is it just to return them then, knowing he might harm someone?
Oh, probably not. That seems dangerous.
Exactly. Cephalus has to agree. So that simple definition, just pay your debts, doesn't hold up in all situations. Socrates shows it's more complicated.
So he wasn't giving answers, but showing that the easy answers weren't good enough, making people think deeper.
That's the core of it. Using reason to examine our beliefs, not just accepting them blindly. And this relates directly back to our own lives.
How so?
The chapter uses the example of equality in queues, We've all been there, right, waiting in line.
Oh, yeah. Grocery store, bus stop, ticket counter.
And someone just walks up and cuts in front. How does that feel?
Infuriating. Like, who do they think they are? It's just not fair. We all want an equal chance, right?
That feeling comes from a sense of fairness, a desire for equal opportunity in that specific context.
But then, what about, say, special queues or priority seating for elderly people or people with disabilities?
Right. Do we usually get angry about that?
No, generally not. That seems different. It seems fair in a different way.
Exactly. We recognize that treating everyone identically isn't always the same as treating everyone fairly. Sometimes we need to account for different needs or circumstances.
So equality isn't just about sameness, it's more nuanced.
Very much so. And this gets even clearer when we look at bigger social and economic inequalities.
Like poverty.
Yeah. People lacking basic needs, food, shelter, healthcare. Children who can't go to school because they have to work or because their families can't afford it, especially girls sometimes.
Even if the law, like the Indian Constitution, guarantees primary education.
Right. The formal right exists, but for many, the reality is very different. Huge barriers remain.
So the equal opportunity isn't really equal if someone's starting way behind, lacking basic necessities.
Precisely. So what does equality mean then? In a queue, it means equal chance. For disabilities, it might mean special provisions. For basic needs, it might mean proactive measures like fair distribution of resources, ensuring everyone reaches a minimum standard.
Wow. Okay, so the meaning really shifts depending on the context.
It does. And political theory helps us grapple with these different meanings and contexts. When we feel that unfairness about queue jumping or think about special provisions, we're actually doing a kind of basic political theorizing.
Just without the fancy terms, maybe.
Kind of. Political theorists just systematize that process. They analyze language, debate meanings, explore policy options like midday meal schemes in schools to address hunger and boost attendance among poorer children.
Trying to connect the abstract idea of equality to practical solutions, okay, that makes sense. But back to the big question. Why should we, average people, students, non-politicians, study this stuff?
It's a fair question. The chapter tackles this directly. First, even if you don't become a politician or lawyer, the skills you gain are valuable everywhere.
What kind of skills?
Critical thinking, analyzing arguments, understanding different perspectives. It's a bit like learning math, you know.
Also.
You might not use complex calculus daily, but the logical reasoning, the problem-solving approach that helps in all sorts of jobs and situations.
Okay, I can see that. Transferable skills. What else?
Second, and maybe most importantly, we're all citizens.
Right.
We live in this society together.
Yep.
So having a basic understanding of the political ideas and institutions that shape our world is kind of crucial for being a responsible, engaged citizen.
For voting intelligently, you mean?
That, but also just participating in discussions, understanding the news, maybe getting involved in your community.
Especially now with social media and constant information or misinformation.
Exactly. Political theory helps you move beyond just gut reactions or repeating what you've heard. It encourages thoughtful, informed opinions.
Instead of just having arbitrary preferences, having reasoned arguments.
Precisely. The chapter uses a neat analogy. Citizens are like the audience at a concert.
Okay.
We're not the musicians on stage, maybe, but an informed, appreciative audience influences the performance. Educated, vigilant citizens tend to get more responsive, public-spirited leaders.
A demanding audience gets a better show. I like that.
Third reason. These aren't just abstract concepts out there.
Yeah.
Freedom, equality, discrimination. We encounter these things in our own lives.
Daily sometimes.
Yeah, maybe in our family, schools, workplaces, shopping malls. Discrimination based on caste, religion, gender, class. It happens.
Sadly, yes.
Political theory pushes us to examine our own ideas and feelings about these issues. Where do our biases come from? Can we see things from another perspective?
It helps us become maybe a bit more self-aware, more understanding, perhaps more moderate in our views.
That's the hope. It encourages reflection. And finally, especially for students, it really hones thinking and communication skills.
Oh.
Think about school debates, elocution competitions, even just arguing a point effectively. Political theory gives you practice in thinking systematically about complex issues like justice or equality.
So you can make better arguments for what you believe in, maybe finding common ground.
Exactly. And those skills, clear thinking, persuasive communication, are incredibly valuable in pretty much any path you take.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Chapter 1, Introduction to Political Theory, We've seen politics isn't just government suits,
It's the whole process of how we link together and make decisions.
and political theory is like the toolkit for understanding the core ideas, freedom, equality, justice that underpin it all.
Tracing their history, clarifying their meaning, seeing how they apply today.
We talked about thinkers from Kautilya and Aristotle to Gandhi and Ambedkar.
And how even non-politicians shaped political thought.
And we saw these aren't just dusty old ideas, but concepts constantly being reinterpreted as society changes, like with technology and privacy.
Using analogies like cues and cricket rules to understand evolving interpretations.
And critically, why studying this matters for everyone, for developing useful skills, for responsible citizenship.
For understanding our own experiences and biases, and for communicating more effectively. It makes us better thinkers and participants in society.
It really connects the big ideas to our everyday lives and feelings about fairness.
Absolutely. It encourages that deeper reflection.
So that brings us to a final thought for everyone listening. Thinking about everything we've discussed, especially around equality and justice.
Yeah, consider this. Where in your own life, or maybe your community, do you see these ideas being really challenged or debated right now?
What's one specific situation? And has our chat sparked any new questions or perspectives for you on how we could work towards a more just and equitable society? Something to mull over. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are deep diving into Chapter 2, Freedom.
Yes, freedom. It's a big one.
Definitely. And we've got some really, thought-provoking material here exploring what freedom actually means. Not just for us as individuals, but, for the societies we live in, too.
That's right. And our goal, really, in this deep dive is to kind of pull out the most important ideas about freedom from this chapter.
Okay.
Understand the different angles, the different perspectives, and really try to nail down the key takeaways.
Right, without it feeling too much like a lecture or, homework.
Exactly. Get seriously informed, but in a way that actually sticks.
Okay, sounds good. So to get us started, the chapter really throws you in the deep end, doesn't it? With some powerful examples.
It does. Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom.
Right.
And Aung San Suu Kyi's Freedom from Fear.
Yeah, when you just hear those titles, what sort of jumps out at you?
Oh, the sheer weight of the struggle, I think.
Yeah.
Long Walk immediately paints this picture of, immense perseverance against unbelievable odds.
Yeah.
And then freedom from fear. It highlights that freedom isn't just, physical liberty. It's about our internal state, too.
Exactly. And the chapter really brings Mandela's fight against apartheid in South Africa into sharp focus. I mean, imagine being told where you can live, who you can marry. Just the most basic choices taken away.
By a totally unjust system.
Completely. And then on top of that, spending nearly 3 decades in prison for standing up against it.
It's almost unimaginable, the sacrifice.
It really is.
Yeah.
He gave up his youth, his hobbies. I think the chapter mentions he was a keen boxer.
Yeah, I read that too.
All of that for this ideal.
It just underscores how fundamental freedom is,
Yeah,
to human dignity.
definitely.
And then you look at Aung San Suu Kyi, under house arrest in Myanmar, separated from her family.
And that story about her husband.
Agonizing, facing that choice, not being able to see him when he was dying for fear of not being allowed back into her own country.
Yeah.
And her idea that real freedom is freedom from fear, that really resonates, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's not just about, like you said, physical chains.
No.
Her point about overcoming the fear of what other people think, or fear of authority, or fear of the community's reaction, even just fear of being laughed at.
Things we all feel sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
How often do we maybe hold back, bite our tongues because of those kinds of internal worries? And she connects conquering that internal fear with living a truly dignified life. It does make you wonder about all the sort of little ways we limit ourselves.
So it's like a dual battle then. Overcoming external oppression, yes, but also conquering those internal fears to find real autonomy.
That seems to be a key insight here, yeah.
And what's really interesting is how these, individual stories connect to bigger historical movements.
How so?
Well, the chapter points out that Mandela and Suu Kyi's struggles weren't happening in a vacuum. They mirrored the anti-colonial movements happening across Asia and Africa.
Against European powers.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
gives this broader context, this sort of global yearning for self-determination that their personal sacrifices were part of.
That's a great point. It puts it all on a much bigger canvas.
Yeah.
And there's this simple question posed in the chapter right near the end of that section. What does this principle mean to me? After hearing those stories, it's It's hard not to stop and think about what freedom really signifies in your own life.
Definitely prompts some reflection.
Okay, so we've seen the ideal, the struggle, but what exactly is freedom? According to these sources, how do they define it?
Well, it starts with a pretty straightforward definition, the kind you might expect.
Okay.
Basically, the absence of external constraints.
Right. No external controls, no coercion, being able to make your own decisions, act on your own.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Being left to your own devices. The basic level.
The don't fence me in kind of freedom.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. But then it quickly adds another layer.
Oh, just
saying that freedom also includes expanding the ability of people to freely express themselves and develop their potential.
okay. So not just being left alone, but also having the conditions needed for like creativity and developing your talent.
Precisely. It's about the conditions that allow us to flourish. Both aspects, the chapter argues, are crucial for a truly free society.
Both absence of constraints and presence of opportunity.
Yes, one that lets its members develop their potential with minimum social constraints.
Okay, so imagine negative liberty is like having an empty room you're free inside because no one's stopping you.
Right.
And positive liberty is more like ensuring you actually have stuff in the room, like paintbrushes if you want to paint or books if you want to read.
That's a great analogy. It's about having the means to actually use your freedom.
Which, of course, brings us to the pretty obvious point that a total, complete absence of constraints. Well, that's just not possible in society, is it?
Not realistically, no. We'd be constantly bumping into each other's freedoms, causing chaos.
Total anarchy. So the real question then becomes, which constraints are justified and why?
And this is where the chapter introduces a really interesting concept from Indian political thought, Swaraj.
Yes. Tell us a bit about Swaraj.
Well, it literally means rule of the self.
Okay.
But it has this fascinating dual meaning. It means rule of the self, like self-governance, but also rule over self.
Rule over self, like self-control, discipline.
Exactly. So during the Indian freedom struggle, it wasn't just about kicking out the British, the external rulers. It also carried this deeper meaning of individual and collective self-mastery. Think of Tilak's famous phrase, "Swaraj is my birthright." That really captures the political demand side.
Right. Political independence.
But Gandhi, particularly in Hind Swaraj, really dug into that rule over self aspect.
How did he see it?
He basically said, it is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves. So it becomes about self-respect, taking responsibility, self-realization, freeing ourselves from systems that dehumanize us, but also mastering our own impulses.
So it's both internal and external liberation.
Precisely. Guided by justice. It's not just about getting rid of external control, but also cultivating inner discipline and responsibility, both for individuals and the community.
That really deepens the idea of freedom, doesn't it? It highlights again that we need to differentiate between necessary constraints, the ones that allow for a just society, and the ones that just hold us back.
And it applies not just to individuals, but also to groups, communities, even nations charting their own path.
Okay. So boiling it down, the chapter seems to define freedom as two things working together.
Yeah, essentially. First, minimizing those social constraints that limit our ability to choose freely. That's the negative aspect of freedom. And second, widening the area, the opportunities for individuals, groups, nations to shape their own destiny and develop their potential. That's the positive side, the freedom, too.
And the core value here is enabling choice, letting us use our own judgment, our reason.
Exactly. That capacity for choice and judgment is fundamental.
Okay, that makes sense. So we know what freedom is, more or less, but where do the things that limit our freedom actually come from? They don't just appear out of thin air.
No, definitely not. The chapter points to a few key sources. The most obvious one is domination and external control.
Like colonial rule. Or apartheid.
Exactly. Imposed by force. Governments can also be a source through the laws they create. That's sort of the power of rulers over the people, the classic top-down restriction.
Right. Though ideally a democratic government is meant to protect freedom by giving citizens some control over the rulers.
That's the ideal, yes. But the chapter also makes a crucial point that constraints aren't only from governments or force.
What else?
Social inequality can be a major source. Think of the caste system, for example.
Okay. Restrictions built into the social fabric itself.
Exactly. And also extreme economic inequality. If you're struggling for basic survival, how free are you really?
That connects to Subhas Chandra Bose's idea mentioned in the text, doesn't it? His call for all-round freedom.
Yes, including equal distribution of wealth and getting rid of social barriers like caste It's about the whole picture: political, social, and economic freedom.
So freedom isn't just an abstract political idea. It's deeply tied to our actual social and economic lives.
Absolutely. Lacking basic needs or facing systemic discrimination severely limits your real-world freedom, even if no law explicitly stops you.
Okay, so constraints come from various places. And we've sort of accepted that some level of constraint seems unavoidable, maybe even necessary. But why? Why do we need them? Wouldn't the ideal be, maximum freedom, minimum rules?
Well, the chapter paints a picture of what a world with zero constraints might look like.
Not pretty.
Probably utter chaos.
Right.
Think about it. Everyone with different ideas, clashing ambitions, competing for scarce resources.
Right. Everyone doing exactly what they want when they want.
It'd be like rush hour traffic, but with zero traffic lights or rules. Just instant gridlock. And probably a lot of shouting.
Ah, yeah, I can picture that. The chapter gives some pretty down-to-earth examples too, right? Like road rage, fights over parking spots.
Even arguments about films or what topping belongs on pizza. It shows how easily conflict arises, even over small things, if there are no agreed-upon ways to navigate disagreements.
Okay, so we need some mechanisms to manage conflict and stop things from just descending into a free-for-all.
Exactly. The ideal society, the chapter suggests, isn't one with no rules, but one where individuals can hold their own views, develop their own ways of living, pursue their choices, but do so while respecting that others have different views and will make different choices.
But wait, even that requires a constraint, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, the willingness to respect differing views, even ones we find wrong or offensive, that's a kind of self-restraint we need to impose on ourselves for society to work.
That's a very sharp point. Yes, absolutely. It requires a conscious effort, a constraint we accept for the greater good.
And sometimes our own beliefs are so strong, it's hard to tolerate opposing views, especially if we think they're harmful.
True. And in those situations where commitment is really strong and views clash sharply, the chapter argues that legal and political restraints might become necessary.
To ensure discussion doesn't just become one group forcing its views on another.
Exactly. And also, obviously, to protect individuals from things like bullying or harassment, the law has a role there.
So it all circles back to that fundamental question: which constraints are truly necessary and justifiable? Who gets to decide? What authority can legitimately limit our actions? And crucially, are there some areas of life that should just be completely off limits? No external interference allowed.
And that leads us directly into the thinking of John Stuart Mill and his very famous harm principle.
Ah, yes. This is a big one in discussions about liberty.
Definitely. It's often seen as a cornerstone for figuring out when constraints on freedom are legitimate.
The chapter quotes him, right? Something like, "The sole end for which mankind are warranted in interfering is self-protection to prevent harm to others."
That's the core idea. Basically, the only justification for interfering with someone's liberty is to stop them from harming someone else.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Mill makes a distinction, doesn't he?
Yes, a really important one, between self-regarding actions and other-regarding actions.
Self-regarding. Those only affect the person doing them.
Right. And other-regarding actions are those that have consequences, potentially negative ones, for other people.
And Mill's argument is?
For self-regarding actions, things that only impact you, the state or society really has no business getting involved. It's your life, your choice, essentially.
My business, as the chapter puts it.
Yeah.
But when your actions start affecting others negatively.
That's when interference might be justified. If you're causing harm to others, then there's a case for stepping in.
Might be justified, so not automatically.
No. Mill was very clear that because freedom is so incredibly valuable, we should only restrict it in, quote, special circumstances.
And when the harm caused is serious.
Exactly. Serious harm, not just any little annoyance.
So, like the example in the chapter, someone playing loud music might be annoying, but Mill would say that probably only warrants social disapproval, your neighbors giving you birdie looks.
Right. Maybe asking you to turn it down.
Yeah.
But probably not calling the police immediately.
Legal punishment should be reserved for serious harm to definite individual.
Yes. We should, according to Mill, be prepared to tolerate some level of inconvenience or differing lifestyles to protect freedom overall.
Tolerance is key, even for viewpoints we don't like, as long as they aren't causing serious harm.
But, and this is important, things like hate campaigns that do cause serious harm can be constrained under this principle.
Okay, so there is a line. But even when constraining something like hate speech, the chapter warns against going too far, right?
Absolutely. The constraints shouldn't destroy freedom itself in the process. You might restrict someone's right to hold public meetings after warnings, perhaps, but you wouldn't say impose life imprisonment just for expressing hateful views.
It's about proportionality. The response needs to fit the harm.
Precisely. And this ties into the concept mentioned from the Indian Constitution, reasonable restrictions.
Meaning any constraint has to be justifiable by reason, not arbitrary or excessive.
Exactly. It has to be logical, defensible, and not disproportionate to whatever action is being restricted. And there's a strong caution against just getting into the habit of slapping restrictions on things we don't like.
It's a slippery slope, as they say.
It can be. Now, building on this, the chapter revisits those two dimensions of freedom we talked about earlier.
Ah, the freedom from and freedom to.
Right, but it gives them their more formal philosophical labels: negative liberty and positive liberty.
Okay, let's get these definitions straight. Negative liberty is.
That's the freedom from. It's about seeking an inviolable area where the individual can basically do, be, or become whatever they want without external interference.
Like a protected zone, a do not disturb sign on certain aspects of your life.
Exactly. The core question is, what belongs in this minimum area of non-interference? The chapter uses the example of choosing what clothes to wear, should that be entirely up to the individual.
That's a good question. Where do we draw that line?
That's the kind of thing negative liberty theorists focus on.
Okay. And positive liberty.
That's more concerned with freedom, too. It asks the question, who governs me? And the ideal answer is, I govern myself.
So self-mastery again, like Swaraj.
Very much related, yes. The chapter mentions thinkers like Rousseau, Hegel, Marx, Gandhi, Aurobindo in this context.
And what does positive liberty focus on, practically speaking?
It focuses on the conditions, the relationship between the individual and society, that enable people to develop themselves fully, reducing the constraints that hinder that development.
Like the plant analogy you used earlier, needing the right soil, sun, water.
Exactly. Positive liberty proponents argue that individuals need enabling conditions materially, like not living in poverty or facing unemployment, politically, like having a say in decisions, and socially, like access to education.
So negative liberty is about keeping others out, ensuring non-interference. Positive liberty is about ensuring the conditions are right within society for people to flourish.
That's a good way to put it. Negative liberty seeks to expand that zone of non-interference, while positive liberty focuses more on the character of society itself and how it supports or hinders individual potential.
They sound like they often go together, but the chapter does add a word of caution, doesn't it?
It does. It notes that arguments for positive liberty acting for someone's own good, or to help them realize their true potential, can sometimes be misused by authoritarian regimes to justify controlling people's lives.
Right. We know what's best for you, so we'll make you free by controlling you. That kind of dangerous logic.
Exactly. It's a potential pitfall to be aware of.
Okay. Now, one area that's almost always put firmly in that minimum zone of non-interference, that negative liberty space, is freedom of expression.
Yes, this gets special attention. And again, J.S. Mill is central here.
He was a big defender of free speech, wasn't he?
Hugely. Even for ideas considered false or misleading, he offered 4 main reasons why even seemingly wrong ideas should be allowed expression, outlined in On Liberty.
All right, let's hear them. Why tolerate falsehoods?
Okay, first, Mill argued that no idea is ever completely totally false. It usually contains at least some element of truth. If you ban it, you lose that fragment of truth.
Interesting. Okay, number 2.
Second, truth isn't static. It emerges from the clash of opposing views. Ideas we think are wrong today might have actually helped refine the ideas we now hold to be correct. It's part of the process.
Like intellectual sparring makes the truth stronger.
Kind of, yeah. Third, this conflict of ideas is continuously valuable. Even a widely accepted truth can become just an unthinking prejudice, a cliché, if it's never challenged.
So challenge keeps truth vital and understood.
Exactly. It forces us to re-examine why we believe something.
Makes sense. And the 4th reason.
Fourth, we simply cannot be absolutely certain that what we currently hold to be true is true. History is littered with examples of ideas once suppressed as false that later turned out to be true.
Like the Earth revolving around the sun.
For instance. So, suppressing ideas carries the risk of losing valuable knowledge, maybe even the actual truth.
Wow. Those are 4 really powerful arguments for, well, intellectual humility, and open debate.
They really are.
The chapter then connects this to real-world examples, mentioning demands to ban books, plays, films, academic articles.
Yeah, it lists several controversies, particularly in India. Deepa Mehta's film about widows, Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, The Last Temptation of Christ, The Play Minathram Bolti.
Right. These examples really highlight that tension between freedom of expression and other societal concerns or sensitivities.
Definitely. And it brings up Voltaire's famous quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
A classic line. But the chapter asks, how deep does that commitment really run for most of us, especially when faced with views we find truly abhorrent?
It's easy to say, harder to live by sometimes.
And the text raises this important point about banning things, that it might seem like an easy short-term fix, but it can create bad precedents.
A habit of banning, as it puts it, leading potentially to a less tolerant society overall.
Which then brings up the difficult question. If banning is ever justified, when? It mentions film censorship as a related idea where maybe specific parts are cut rather than the whole thing being banned.
That's an interesting comparison. Editing versus outright banning. It acknowledges potential harm, but seeks a less drastic solution, though, again, who decides what gets cut is a huge question.
And there's that other example of constraints on expression confidentiality contracts for royal household staff in England.
Right, a different kind of restriction, contractual rather than state censorship. It
Oh,
just shows the variety of ways expression can be limited.
So the takeaway seems to be that constraints exist in many forms, they affect us differently, and restrictions backed by organized power state, social, religious, are the hardest to fight.
Whereas restrictions we willingly accept for our own goals feel very different. Coercion, however, is always a curtailment of freedom.
Okay, that brings us near the end. The chapter circles back to emphasize the link between freedom and responsibility.
Yes. It's not just about absence of constraints or even just having opportunities. It's also about the capacity and the ability to make choices.
And making choices means.
Accepting responsibility for our actions and their consequences. You can't really have meaningful freedom without taking responsibility for how you use it.
This connects to why advocates of liberty argue children need parental care and guidance.
Exactly. To help them build that capacity for making good choices, for reasoned judgment, and for shouldering responsibility. It's not something we're just born with.
It's developed through education, cultivating judgment, and also, importantly, by limiting the authority of the state and society to overstep. It's a balance, fostering capacity while protecting autonomy.
Freedom and responsibility, then. Two sides of the same coin, really.
Yep. Inextricably linked, you could say.
Well, this has been quite the journey through Chapter 2, Freedom. A really insightful deep dive.
Agreed. We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. From those powerful ideals embodied by Mandela and Sukai to unpacking what freedom actually means, that negative freedom from and the positive freedom too.
Yeah. Tackling why constraints are sometimes needed, Mill's harm principle as a guide.
Right. The nuances of negative versus positive liberty and that whole complex, vital area of freedom of expression.
And ending on that crucial link between freedom and responsibility.
So it leaves us and you, our listener, with a lot to think about.
Considering everything we've discussed, this intricate balance between individual freedom and, the needs of social order, what do you see as the most critical challenge to freedom in our world today? And maybe how might some of the principles we've talked about, like the harm principle or the different ideas of liberty, help us think about tackling that challenge?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is indeed something to reflect on, and perhaps revisit your own understanding of what freedom really means. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are deep diving into Chapter 3, titled Equality.
Exactly. Yeah, you sent this chapter over, and it's a really interesting one, something we talk about all the time, equality, but
But when you actually dig in, there's a lot more under the surface, right?
there really is, layers upon layers.
Absolutely. So for everyone listening, think of this as us unpacking that chapter for you. We're aiming to, pull out the really key takeaways. We'll explore what equality actually means, why it's such a big deal historically and morally.
And politically, too.
Definitely. And whether treating everyone exactly the same is even the goal.
That's a crucial point, yeah.
We'll look at how societies try to promote fairness, the differences between political, social, economic equality.
And touch on those big isms, socialism, Marxism, liberalism, feminism, and how they view equality.
Right. So consider this your, let's say, efficient guide to getting up to speed on this whole concept.
And it's good to remember, like, the chapter does have data, those fact sheets on inequality.
Yeah, some pretty striking numbers in there.
Right, but our goal isn't really to, drown you in statistics. It's more about understanding the ideas of the different facets of equality.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The big one. Why does equality even matter? Seems obvious, but the chapter gives some solid grounding.
It really does. It frames equality as a fundamental moral and political ideal, something societies have been striving towards for, well, centuries.
And it connects it back to, like, basic human dignity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Across many faiths and philosophies, there's this core idea. All humans are fundamentally equal, maybe as creations of God or just by virtue of being human.
Okay, so that's the moral side. What about the political angle?
Politically, it translates into this powerful idea that everyone has equal worth. Doesn't matter your color, gender, race, nationality.
Everyone deserves the same basic consideration and respect because we share this common humanity.
Precisely. And that shared humanity is like the foundation for huge concepts. Think universal human rights, or even the idea of crimes against humanity.
Wow. Okay. So it underpins some really big legal and ethical frameworks.
It does. Violating that basic equality is seen as an offense against everyone, fundamentally.
And this isn't a new idea, is it? The chapter mentions the French Revolution.
Yeah, liberty, equality, fraternity. That was a direct challenge, wasn't it? Against the aristocracy, the monarchy. That whole system built on inherited privilege.
A massive push for equality.
And you see it again later in the 20th century with the anti-colonial struggles across Asia and Africa. A huge part of that was demanding equality, rejecting the idea that one nation could just rule over another.
So it's been a driving force for major historical changes.
Absolutely. But the chapter also makes the point that the struggle isn't over.
No, sadly not. It mentions groups today, women, Dalits, other marginalized communities still fighting for genuine equality.
Yeah, there's often this gap, isn't there, between the ideals we state, even the laws we write, and the reality people actually experience.
Which brings us to that slightly awkward point the chapter raises.
The paradox.
Yeah, the paradox. Almost everyone agrees equality is good, it's in constitutions. Yet, look around, inequality is everywhere. Globally, locally.
It's highly visible. Slums next to luxury apartments, schools with everything versus schools with next to nothing. Food waste while people starve.
It's like two different worlds sometimes, side by side. The legal promises versus the reality on the street.
And those fact sheet on global inequalities numbers the chapter includes, they really hammer this home. Did you see the one about the richest 50 people?
Having more wealth than the poorest, 400 million.
Yeah.
That just stops you in your track.
It's almost unbelievable. And then the income share poorest 40% get 5% of global income. Richest 10% control 54%.
It's a massively skewed distribution, isn't it?
Hugely. And it's not just money. Consumption patterns, energy use.
Yeah.
The first world, about a quarter of the population, uses the vast majority of resources.
The differences in consumption, water, energy, steel between rich and poor countries were just enormous.
And the human cost. That statistic about maternal mortality rates, Nigeria versus Canada. It's not just an inequality, it's a life or death difference based purely on where you're born.
Heartbreaking. And the chapter also mentions the environmental aspect, the pollution burden shifting.
Right, another layer of inequality with long-term global consequences.
Then it zooms in, looking at India with the 2011 census data, access to electricity, tap water, bathrooms, TVs, transport. The rural-urban divide, it's stark.
It really prompts you to think, where does my own situation fit into this picture?
So we have this puzzle, widespread agreement on equality, widespread inequality in reality. Are these differences just inevitable, reflections of talent, or are they baked into our social systems?
And that's why equality is such a central theme for political thinkers. It forces us to ask these tough questions.
Like, what does equality even mean, given that we are all different? What are we actually trying to achieve?
Are we aiming for sameness in income and status, or something else?
What kind of equality? For whom? And crucially, should we always treat everyone identically?
That's a big one. How do we decide which differences in treatment are fair and which aren't?
And ultimately, what can we actually do? What policies might create a more equal society? Lots to chew on.
Definitely.
Okay, so we know why it matters, but what is equality? The chapter suggests it's not as simple as just, treating everyone the same all the time.
Right. It starts with something most people agree on. Making distinctions based on race or color, for example, feels fundamentally wrong. It violates that basic sense of equal respect we owe each other as humans.
That seems pretty straightforward. But then it adds a layer of complexity,
Yeah, it says equal respect doesn't automatically mean identical treatment in every single situation. Society needs different roles, different jobs.
which come with different levels of status, different rewards.
Exactly. And some of those differences might seem acceptable, like the chapter mentions a prime minister or a general having a certain rank or privileges tied to their role.
As long as it's tied to the role and not misused.
Precisely. It's about the function, the responsibility.
But contrast that with, say, a child born in poverty who lacks basic nutrition or education just because of their circumstances. That feels entirely different.
It feels deeply unjust. And that's the core question the chapter poses. Which differences are acceptable and which aren't? It strongly suggests that differences in treatment based purely on birth, religion, race, caste, gender are generally unacceptable.
Okay. But what about differences that arise later, like people pursuing different goals, achieving different levels of success?
The chapter argues that's not inherently unequal, provided everyone have the opportunity to develop their potential in the first place. People having different ambitions or talents doesn't automatically make a society unequal.
So the key is that opportunities shouldn't be predetermined by birth or social background.
Exactly, which leads directly to the concept of equality of opportunity.
Right. Define that for us based on the chapter.
It's the idea that everyone, simply by being human, deserves the same rights and, crucially, the same opportunities to develop their skills and talents to pursue their goals.
So the playing field should be level at the start.
That's the essence. The chapter acknowledges that people will make different choices, have different abilities, lead to different outcomes. But that's okay, it argues. The real inequality, the injustice, comes when people lack access to basic goods, education, healthcare, safe housing. That's what prevents fair opportunity.
This brings us to that distinction the chapter makes between natural and social inequalities.
Yeah, a classic distinction. Natural inequalities are seen as the differences we're born with, inherent capabilities, talents, being naturally gifted at math or music.
And the traditional view is that these are sort of fixed, unchangeable.
Pretty much. Whereas socially produced inequalities are the ones created by society. Unequal opportunities, discrimination, how society values different kinds of work.
Like valuing intellectual work over manual labor, perhaps? Or treating people differently based on race or caste.
Exactly. These reflect society's values, and the chapter points out some of those values might be unjust.
But the chapter also cautions against relying too heavily on this natural social split, right?
It does. It notes that this distinction, while useful sometimes, can be tricky because long-standing social inequalities can get rationalized as being natural over time. It becomes a way to justify unfair systems.
Like those historical examples it gives, claiming women were naturally weaker or black people naturally less intelligent to justify discrimination.
Terrible examples, but they illustrate the point perfectly. Those were social constructs presented as natural facts. Thankfully, those views are now widely challenged.
And technology is blurring the lines, too.
That's another fascinating point the chapter makes. Things once seen as fixed natural limitations, disabilities, for instance, can often be mitigated or overcome with technology, medical advances. Think assistive tech, or even Stephen Hawking's example.
Right. So arguing someone shouldn't get help or fair reward because of a perceived natural limitation becomes much harder to justify.
Definitely. So the conclusion seems to be that this natural versus social distinction isn't a foolproof guide for policy.
So where does that leave us?
Well, the chapter suggests many thinkers now focus more on whether inequalities stem from circumstances beyond our control, like family background or birth, versus those arising from our choices. And it's those inequalities we're born into that are the main focus for equality advocates.
Got it. Making sure the starting line is fair regardless of who your parents are.
That's the crux of it.
Okay, moving on. The chapter identifies 3 dimensions of equality: political, social, and economic, and it argues we need to tackle all 3. Let's start with political equality.
Right. In democracies, political equality basically means equal citizenship for everyone.
So everyone gets the same basic rights under the law.
Yes, things like the right to vote, freedom of expression, movement, association, freedom of beliefs. These are usually guaranteed by the Constitution and laws, the legal rights.
But the chapter cautions that just having these rights on paper doesn't guarantee actual political equality, does it?
No. Big differences in wealth or social standing can mean some people have a much louder voice or more influence than others, even if they technically have the same rights.
So resources matter, having the time, money, connections to actually participate effectively.
Exactly. That's where the demand for a level playing field comes in, even within the political sphere.
So political and legal equality are necessary, but maybe not sufficient on their own.
That's the key takeaway. A vital first step, but just one piece of the puzzle.
Which leads us to social equality. How does the chapter describe this?
It positions social equality as building on political equality. You need equality of opportunity to make those political rights meaningful.
So it's not just about removing legal barriers, but ensuring people actually have a fair chance to compete.
Precisely. A fair and equal chance for everyone, regardless of background, to access social goods like education, healthcare, good jobs.
And this requires addressing those underlying social and economic gaps.
Yes. The chapter stresses the need to minimize those inequalities and guarantee minimum standards for everyone: adequate healthcare, good education, nutrition, a minimum wage. Without those basics, it says, equal competition is almost impossible and potential gets wasted.
It's like ensuring everyone has the basic tools needed before the competition starts.
Well put. And the chapter also brings up specific social barriers, like discriminatory customs or attitudes maybe limiting women's inheritance or discouraging certain groups from higher education, even if it's legally allowed.
So it's about laws and social norms.
Definitely. The state has a role in preventing discrimination and creating incentives, but social groups and individuals also need to challenge prejudice and support equal rights. It takes effort from all sides.
Okay, and the third dimension, economic equality. What's the focus here?
This is about the distribution of wealth, property, and income. Significant differences between individuals or classes signal economic inequality.
And the chapter mentions ways to measure it, like the gap between rich and poor or the poverty rate.
Right, though it also acknowledges that absolute economic equality, everyone having the exact same amount, has probably never existed and isn't the primary goal for most.
So what is the goal generally in democracies?
Mostly, it's about equal opportunity. The belief is that if opportunities are fair, talented, and determined people can improve their economic situation. Some inequality might remain, but there's potential for social mobility.
But the chapter warns about inequalities becoming too entrenched, right?
Now,
Passing down through generations.
yes, that's seen as a major danger. It can lead to deep social divisions, resentment, even violence. And it makes reform harder because the wealthy and powerful often resist changes that might affect their position.
Creates a cycle that's hard to break.
Exactly.
All right, let's shift gears slightly. The chapter looks at how different schools of thought ideologies view equality, starting with feminism.
Right. Feminism, at its core, is presented as a political doctrine arguing for equal rights for women and men.
And the key belief is that the inequalities we see aren't necessarily natural.
Precisely. Feminists argue many inequalities between men and women are socially constructed and can be changed to allow for equally fulfilling lives.
The chapter introduces the concept of patriarchy here.
Yes, defining it as a broad system, social, economic, cultural, that tends to value men over women and gives men more power. It's often underpinned by assumptions about natural differences, justifying unequal roles.
And feminists push back against that natural justification.
Strongly. They make that crucial distinction between sex, the biological differences, and gender, the socially constructed roles and expectations.
Like the example about childbirth. Just because women biologically bear children doesn't mean they must solely be responsible for raising them.
Exactly. That caregiving role is largely a matter of gender, of social expectation, not just biology. Feminists argue much gender inequality is produced by society, not nature.
The chapter also mentions the public-private divide.
Yeah, how patriarchal systems often assign women to the private domestic sphere and men to the public sphere of work and politics.
But in reality, women often juggle both, right? The double burden.
Right. Working outside the home and doing most of the domestic work, but often having less influence in that public domain. The feminist goal, the chapter states, is to eliminate this divide and all forms of gender inequality.
Okay, now Marxism. Marx's focus was heavily economic, correct?
Very much so. The chapter explains Marx saw the root cause of deep inequality as the private ownership of key economic resources, land, factories, capital, the means of production.
And the idea is that this ownership concentration creates huge wealth disparities.
Yes, but not just wealth. Marx argued it also gives the owning class significant political power. They can influence laws, state policies, potentially in ways that undermine democracy itself.
So economic power translates to political power.
That's the Marxist view. They believe economic inequality underpins other social inequalities like status and privilege.
And their solution, according to the chapter.
To tackle inequality effectively, they argue you need to go beyond just equal opportunities and ensure public or social control over those essential resources and property.
A fundamental shift in ownership.
A very fundamental shift. The chapter notes these views are debatable, of course, but they raise critical questions about economic structures and fairness.
And contrasting with Marxism, we have liberalism. What's their approach?
Liberals, as presented here, generally champion competition as the fairest and most efficient way to distribute resources and rewards.
So they have more faith in the market.
Generally, yes. They believe the state might need to ensure a basic minimum standard and equal opportunities, but beyond that, fair competition should determine outcomes.
The idea being that if competition is open and fair, the resulting inequalities aren't necessarily unjust.
Right. They believe fair competition allows talent and effort to be rewarded and prevents inequalities from becoming rigidly entrenched. People can move up based on merit.
The chapter mentions examples like supporting fair entrance exams for universities or jobs.
Exactly. Regulating the process to ensure a fair chance, accepting that not everyone will succeed, but seeing the distribution as relatively just under those conditions.
And unlike Marxists, liberals don't necessarily see all forms of inequality as linked.
Correct. The chapter says they tend to view political, economic, and social inequalities as distinct spheres that might require different approaches.
So for liberals, the main issue isn't inequality per se.
But unjust and entrenched inequalities, those that block individual potential and fair competition. The focus is on removing those barriers.
Okay, that clarifies the different perspectives. So, given these different views, how can we promote equality in practice?
Well, acknowledging the ongoing debate between socialists and liberals, the chapter outlines some common strategies. The starting point is usually establishing formal equality.
Which means getting rid of the official legal barriers.
Exactly. Ending formal systems of inequality and privilege enshrined in law or custom, like discriminatory voting laws, job restrictions based on gender, or the caste system abolishing those legal structures.
So, governments and laws need to stop protecting discrimination.
Absolutely. Constitutions, like India's, often explicitly prohibit discrimination on various grounds and abolish practices like untouchability. Most modern democracies formally accept legal equality as a baseline.
But we already established that formal equality isn't the whole story.
Right. It's necessary but not sufficient, which leads to the next idea. Equality through differential treatment.
This sounds counterintuitive, treating people differently to achieve equality.
It can seem that way, but the logic is that sometimes acknowledging specific differences is required to ensure people can actually enjoy equal rights.
Can you give examples from the chapter?
Sure. Providing ramps or special equipment for people with disabilities ensures they have equal access. Offering special protection for women working night shifts helps ensure their equal right to work isn't compromised by safety concerns.
I see. So it's not about creating privilege, but about overcoming specific barriers to participation.
Exactly. These measures are seen as enhancing equality, not infringing upon it.
But figuring out which differences need accommodation and how is tricky.
Very. That's a constant debate in most societies. What policies truly overcome barriers to equal opportunity?
And this is where affirmative action comes into the discussion.
Yes. The chapter introduces it as a set of policies designed precisely to enhance equality of opportunity, mentioning India's reservation system as a prominent example.
Let's unpack affirmative action a bit more, the core idea.
It's based on the premise that formal equality alone can't undo deep-seated historical inequalities. Positive measures are needed to counteract the cumulative effects of past discrimination and exclusion.
So it's about actively correcting for past wrongs.
In essence, yes. And it can take various forms. Targeted funding for disadvantaged communities, scholarships, special consideration in admissions, or hiring like quotas or reservations.
And the justification for reservations specifically.
The argument presented is that certain groups have faced such long-term systemic prejudice and exclusion that they simply cannot compete on equal terms immediately. Special measures are needed, at least temporarily, to help level the playing field and build a more just society.
Temporarily being a key word there.
Ideally, yes. The expectation is often that these measures are time-bound, designed to help communities overcome disadvantages so they can eventually compete equally without them.
But affirmative action is controversial. What are the main criticisms the chapter mentions?
The core criticism revolves around that principle of differential treatment. Does treating people differently based on group identity actually lead to equality? Critics argue it can be reverse discrimination, denying equal treatment to individuals from other groups.
And that it might reinforce the very group distinctions equality seeks to overcome.
Exactly. The argument is that equality should mean treating everyone as an individual, regardless of caste, race, etc.
It highlights that tension between equality as a broad societal goal and the equal rights of individuals.
Precisely. Everyone deserves equal consideration, but is the competition fair if the starting points are vastly different due to historical injustice?
The chapter uses the powerful example of a first-generation learner versus someone from an educated family background.
Right. It argues that groups historically excluded need and deserve special help to have a truly fair chance.
But it also points out shortcomings in providing basic support.
Yes. It notes that many societies, including India, struggle to provide quality education and healthcare universally, especially for deprived populations. Huge disparities in schooling quality, for instance, create major barriers long before affirmative action even comes into play. Lack of resources for coaching, high fees, these prevent fair competition for higher education too.
So these underlying socioeconomic inequalities are a massive hurdle to equal opportunity.
Most theorists agree on that. The debate is really about the best policies to address it. Is it reservations? Or more focus on early-stage interventions, improving basic schooling for all? How do we even define deprived just economically, or considering social factors like caste?
And the ultimate test for any policy is whether it actually works, whether it creates a fairer, more egalitarian society.
That's the bottom line. And it loops back to that crucial distinction, treating everyone identically versus treating everyone as equal. The latter might sometimes require differential treatment, but the goal must always be greater equality.
But we need to be cautious, given history.
Absolutely. Differential treatment was central to systems like apartheid and caste, so liberals especially are wary of deviating from identical treatment unless there's very strong justification.
The chapter's Let's Think scenarios touch on this complexity: maternity leave, support for disabled students, accommodating religious practices.
Yeah, they force you to consider.
Mm.
When is different treatment justified to ensure equality, and when does it cross a line? It connects to the women's movement realizing they needed things like maternity leave and childcare to make their hard-won rights to work truly meaningful and allow equal competition.
So the concluding thought on this section is,
We constantly need to ask if differential treatment is essential for ensuring equal rights for everyone, while being vigilant that it doesn't create new hierarchies or reinforce old ones. It's a tool that must be justified solely as a means toward the more just and egalitarian end.
a really delicate balancing act.
Indeed.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into Chapter 3 on equality, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. From why equality matters, its moral and political roots.
To unpacking what it actually means, distinguishing between identical treatment and treating people as equals.
We looked at the different dimensions, political, social, economic, and how they interact.
And explored how different perspectives, feminism, Marxism, liberalism, approach the whole concept.
Plus, delving into the practical challenges and strategies, like formal equality versus differential treatment, and the complexities of affirmative action.
And while the chapter provided those facts and figures on inequality, the main goal, as we discussed, was really to understand the nature of equality and the challenges in pursuing it.
Exactly. To get a handle on the concepts and the ongoing debates surrounding how societies can become fairer.
So, as a final thought for our listeners to take away, building on everything we've discussed, here's something to ponder.
Okay.
Considering all these different dimensions of equality, the different viewpoints, and the debates about how best to achieve it, what do you believe is the single most crucial step a society could take right now to move closer to true equality, and why?
Ooh, that's a good one. No easy answers there.
Definitely something to reflect on.
A really important question. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the many facets of equality.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the deep dive.
Okay, welcome everyone. Today we are deep diving into Chapter 4, which is all about social justice.
A big topic, and one that everyone seems to have strong feelings about.
Right. It's funny, justice. It kind of feels like love in a way. You know it when you see it, or maybe more often when you don't see it. But try defining it.
Uh-huh. That's where it gets tricky. People react very passionately when they feel something's unfair.
Totally. But unlike love, which is often, personal, Justice is really about society, isn't it?
Yes, it's about how we organize things publicly,
Yeah.
how we distribute, well, everything, social goods, duties, opportunities.
It's fundamental, absolutely central to politics, really.
Couldn't agree more. How a society approaches justice shapes pretty much everything else.
So our mission here is to unpack some of these principles of justice, especially distributive justice, who gets what, and then really dig into John Rawls' argument for, well, a fair society.
It's a really influential framework, worth understanding.
Definitely. Before we dive deep, though, thinking about fairness, does any small, maybe even silly example of unfairness jump out from your past? Like, remember being a kid and someone definitely got the bigger piece of cake?
Oh, absolutely. I think sibling rivalries are basically early training grounds for justice debates. Who got the front seat? Who had the remote?
Exactly. The high stakes of the TV remote. Okay, so let's get a bit more serious. Justice isn't exactly a new idea people just cooked up, is it?
Not at all. Every culture really has wrestled with it. The chapter gives some great examples.
Like in ancient India, this concept of dharma. Justice was tied up in that, and it was like the king's #1 job to uphold it.
A core responsibility, often seen as vital for maintaining cosmic and social order.
And then you have Confucius in China suggesting basically that kings maintain justice by, well, rewarding the good guys and punishing the bad guys.
A focus on actions and consequences to keep society harmonious. Seems straightforward.
But then ancient Athens, Plato's Republic, that whole back and forth with Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus, it gets really juicy there.
Ah, yes, the classic challenge. Why be just?
Exactly. Glaucon's basically saying, look, let's be honest. Doing wrong feels good if you get away with it. It's suffering wrong that's terrible. People avoid paying taxes, they lie. You seem to get ahead.
It's a question that I think still resonates today. The apparent advantages of cutting corners versus playing by the rules.
Yeah, Glaucon argues laws are just this agreement we make, like, okay, fine, I won't cheat you if you don't cheat me, just to avoid the pain of being wronged ourselves.
It frames justice almost as a pragmatic necessity, a social contract born out of self-interest rather than some higher moral calling.
But Socrates, he pushes back hard on that, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that if everyone acts unjustly, the whole system breaks down. Society becomes chaotic, and ultimately everyone suffers.
So being just isn't just about being good, it's actually smart in our own long-term interest.
That's a key part of his argument, but he also goes further.
Right, he says justice isn't just about helping friends and harming enemies or only looking out for #1. It's about the well-being of the entire community.
He uses that analogy of a doctor. A good doctor cares for the health of their patients, not their own profit primarily. A just ruler, similarly, cares for the people.
Giving each person their due. That's the phrase?
Exactly. Making sure everyone gets what they deserve or what they need for the health of the whole society.
And that idea of what is due has devolved, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The chapter brings in Immanuel Kant.
Yes, Kant introduces this crucial idea of inherent human dignity.
So justice isn't just about keeping order anymore. It's about ensuring people have the chance to, develop their talents, chase their dreams.
And importantly, that everyone deserves this equal consideration. Their intrinsic worth as human beings demands it.
Okay, so that leads us into the principles of justice the chapter lays out. First one, equal treatment for equals. Seems simple, but maybe not.
The basic idea is simple. We're all human, so we share fundamental qualities. Therefore, we deserve equal rights and equal treatment.
And this covers things like civil rights, life, liberty, property, political rights, like voting, and social rights, like equal opportunity.
Exactly. And crucially, it means non-discrimination.
Hmm.
Your class, caste, race, gender, none of that should matter for your basic rights and how you're treated.
Judgment should be based on what you do, your actions, not the group you belong to.
Precisely.
The example they give is pretty clear. If two people do the same work, breaking stones, delivering pizzas, whatever, they should get the same pay. Doesn't matter if one's male, one's female, different backgrounds.
Yep. The idea of paying a male teacher more than a female teacher for the exact same job, that clearly violates this principle. It just feels wrong.
It really does. Makes you look around and wonder about some salary gaps, eh? Are they really justified by the work?
It's a fair question, which actually leads us nicely into the second principle.
Proportionate justice. Because sometimes equal treatment isn't the fairest thing.
Right. Imagine taking an exam. You studied hard. Someone else barely looked at the book. If you both got the same mark.
You'd be pretty annoyed. And rightly so. It doesn't feel fair.
Exactly. So, proportionate justice says we should reward people differently, but based on relevant factors like the effort they put in, the skill required, the quality of their work.
But starting from that baseline of equal rights for everyone.
Crucially, yes, it's about acknowledging different contributions might merit different rewards once basic equality is established.
The chapter mentions different kinds of work. Miners facing danger, skilled craftspeople, police officers. Their effort, skills, risks are different. Do their wages always reflect that compared to, say, I don't know, the celebrity influencer?
Huh. Well, that raises some interesting questions about how society values different kinds of work, doesn't it? And whether our current systems accurately reflect this principle of proportionality.
It certainly does. So it's a balancing act then. Equal treatment is the foundation, but proportionality layered on top.
That seems to be the idea for a just society, but there's a third principle too.
Ah, yes, recognition of special needs. This
Mhm.
one feels really important for tackling actual inequality.
It is. This principle argues that sometimes treating people differently is necessary to achieve true social justice.
Because treating everyone the same might sound fair, but if people are starting from wildly different places, say, someone with a disability or someone lacking basic education or health care.
Then treating them equally to someone who has all the advantages can actually cement that inequality, not overcome it. It leads to an unequal society, paradoxically.
So this isn't about contradicting equal treatment.
No, the chapter argues it extends it. It says if people are unequal in relevant ways, like having specific needs or facing systemic disadvantages, then treating them differently can be justified to promote overall equality.
The example from India is powerful here. The history of caste discrimination and the constitutional provisions for reservations in jobs and education for scheduled castes and tribes.
Exactly. That's a concrete policy attempting to address deep-seated historical injustice by recognizing the special needs of disadvantaged groups, aiming to level the playing field.
It's about giving some people the support they need just to get to the same starting line, essentially, not giving them unfair advantages.
That's the goal. Of course, as the chapter notes, agreeing on which inequalities warrant special treatment and how much, that's where the debates get really tough.
Yeah, I could see that. Where do you draw the line? So, for governments, it's this constant juggling act, trying to balance equal treatment, rewarding merit through proportionality, and addressing special needs.
It's a huge challenge. Push too hard on one, you might undermine the others. And different groups in society will always prioritize differently. Harmonizing these is a core function of democratic governance.
Okay, so principles sorted. Now, just distribution. This isn't just about laws being fair on paper,
Yeah.
right? It's about the actual stuff, goods, services, resources.
Precisely. Social justice demands we look at how these things are actually shared out in society, and between nations, too, arguably.
And if there are massive gaps, huge wealth inequalities, deep social divides, the chapter suggests maybe some redistribution is needed to create that level playing field.
That's the argument. That true social justice requires not just legal equality, but also some basic equality in life conditions and opportunities, so people can actually live decent lives and pursue their goals.
They mention abolishing untouchability in India again, promoting access to basic things, and land reforms in some states, trying to share out resources more fairly.
These are real-world attempts to address distributive justice, to change the patterns of who has access to what.
But wow, these discussions get heated. The chapter mentions that debates over resource distribution, like reservations or land, can provoke really strong emotions, even violence sometimes.
Understandably so. People's livelihoods, their sense of fairness, their future prospects, it all feels very immediate and personal.
Which sets the stage perfectly for John Rawls. He tries to offer a rational way to think about this, especially about helping the least well-off. Tell us about his big idea.
Okay, Rawls proposes this fascinating thought experiment. Imagine you have to design the basic structure of society, its main rules and institutions.
Right, but the catch is,
The catch is, you do this behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. You don't know who you'll be in that society.
you don't know if you'll be rich or poor, male or female, what talents you'll have, your race, your religion. Nothing. You're choosing blind.
Exactly. You have no idea about your specific circumstances.
So, the idea is, since you don't know your position, you'll want to set up rules that are fair to everyone, right?
Right.
Especially fair to those who might end up at the bottom.
Precisely. Rawls argues that rational individuals acting in their own self-interest behind this veil would choose principles that ensure even the worst-off position in society is reasonably acceptable.
Because you might end up there yourself. So you'd want things like maybe good basic education, Healthcare, some kind of safety net.
You'd prioritize making sure the floor is relatively high, ensuring basic liberties and opportunities for all, particularly the least advantaged.
It's clever because it doesn't rely on people suddenly becoming saints.
No, not at all. It taps into rational self-interest under conditions of uncertainty. Erasing our identities is impossible in reality, of course, but so is consistent self-sacrifice. Rawls grounds fairness in rationality.
And presumably behind the veil, you'd also want society as a whole to do well, because you might end up privileged too.
Yes, you'd want policies that maximize the prospects of the least advantaged, but also allow for inequalities if they benefit everyone, especially the worst off. It's not about making everyone identical. Fairness emerges from rational choice, not necessarily pre-existing morality.
So Rawls argues rational thinking itself, within this constraint, leads to fair principles for distributing benefits and burdens. That's quite something.
It's a powerful attempt to derive principles of justice from a position of impartiality.
Okay, so if we're trying to pursue social justice based on Rawls and these other ideas, what does the lack of it look like?
Well, the chapter paints a picture of deep, persistent divisions, where the rich and powerful seem to live in a completely different reality from the excluded and deprived.
It's not just about income differences, but when those gaps are so vast and there's basically no hope for people at the bottom to improve things through hard work.
Exactly. That suggests a fundamental lack of fairness and opportunity.
So a just society isn't about absolute equality, but it does need to provide those basic minimum conditions: a healthy, secure life, a chance to develop talents, real equal opportunities.
That's the core idea, ensuring everyone has a decent starting point and the chance to flourish.
And people are trying to define these minimums, right? Governments, the WHO, thinking about basic nutrition, housing, clean water, education, minimum wage.
Yes, there's a growing consensus, at least in principle, that ensuring these basic needs is a key responsibility, particularly for democratic governments.
Though, gosh, actually delivering that, especially in poorer countries, must be incredibly difficult. The budgeting alone.
Practical challenges are immense, absolutely. Resource constraints, political will, logistics. It's complex.
And then there's the whole debate about the best way to help the disadvantaged without unfairly burdening others. Free markets versus the state.
The classic debate. It really gets to the heart of different political and economic philosophies.
So the free market argument is, let individuals own property, make contracts, compete freely. The market will sort things out justly, rewarding merit and talent.
That's the core belief. An unregulated market, or lightly regulated, is seen as the most efficient and fairest distributor of resources.
Though even most free market folks accept some state role, right? Like ensuring a basic minimum standard so competition is at least somewhat fair.
Generally, yes. They might prefer private provision of services, health, education perhaps, with the state providing vouchers or financial help for people to access them, plus support for the elderly and sick.
So the state's main job is like being the referee, maintaining fair rules for competition.
Essentially, yes. Keeping the playing field level, legally speaking, and letting the market determine outcomes based on skills and demand, which they see as neutral factors.
And one argument is more choice for consumers, right? If you can afford it.
Choice and competition driving quality up, theoretically.
Okay, but the counter argument, just because a service exists doesn't mean everyone can get it or afford it. What if it's not profitable to run a good school in a poor rural area?
That's a major critique. Private agencies might just not serve areas where profits are low, leaving people without essential services or with very substandard ones. This leads to the call for government provision.
And even if private services are higher quality.
The cost can be prohibitive for many. And the profit motive itself might lead businesses to cut corners or exploit vulnerable people. The interests don't always align with public good.
So the conclusion seems to be that free markets, left entirely alone, often benefit those already ahead, which strengthens the case for state intervention to ensure basics for everyone.
That's a common conclusion, yes. That some level of state action is needed to ensure universal access to fundamental goods and services and mitigate the inequalities markets can produce.
But it's crucial to remember, as the chapter says, these disagreements in a democracy are normal, even healthy.
Absolutely. They force us to examine different viewpoints, justify our positions. Politics is largely about negotiating these different visions of fairness and distribution.
We know there is still huge inequalities out there, lots of work to do. But hopefully, understanding these principles helps us have better discussions about how to tackle them.
Definitely. It gives us a framework and a common language, even when we disagree on the solutions.
And that final quote from J.S. Mill really sticks with you. Justice implies something which it's not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right.
It brings it right back to the individual, doesn't it? Justice as a fundamental entitlement.
So wrapping up our deep dive today, we've looked at equal treatment, proportionate justice, recognizing special needs, complex stuff.
We've explored Rawls' clever veil of ignorance, trying to ground fairness in rational thought.
And we've touched on the real-world challenges of just distribution and the ongoing debates like free markets versus state action.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. So here's a final thought for our listeners. Considering these different principles, equality, proportionality, special needs, which one do you think should be prioritized most in our society right now, and why? Take a look at current events through that lens. It might change how you see things.
A challenging question, but a vital one as we all navigate the pursuit of a more just society. Hey there, you fascinating human. Welcome back for another deep dive.
Hey, good to be back.
So today, we are deep diving into Chapter 5, and it's titled Rights.
Rights, yeah. It's one of those words we hear all the time, isn't it?
Totally. You know, from the right to vote, maybe the right to clean air people talk about now?
Yeah.
Even, like, the right to argue over the TV remote, maybe?
Well, maybe not that last one officially.
Yeah.
But yeah, it covers a huge range. And that's kind of the point, right? What actually makes something a right?
Exactly. That's our mission for today. We're going to try and understand the fundamentals. What are rights, really? Where did the idea even come from? Are there different kinds? And, why does it all matter?
We'll be drawing on discussions about the classic political and civil rights, but also looking at these newer demands that keep popping up.
And we'll touch on that big one, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, too.
Definitely. So yeah, let's try and get to the bottom of what rights are all about.
Okay, let's dive right in then. What is a right at its core? Because it feels simple, but I suspect it's not just anything I happen to want.
You're spot on. It's not just any want. Fundamentally, a right is an entitlement, or you could say a justified claim.
Justified claim. Okay, so my wanting to wear, I don't know, mismatched socks to a fancy party, probably not a right.
Probably not justified in that context, no.
Yeah.
It's a preference, a desire. Rights are claims that we sort of collectively as a society see as really essential, necessary for living a life with respect and dignity.
Ah, respect and dignity. That sounds key. So like the right to earn a living?
That's a great example. We generally view the ability to work and support yourself as vital for self-respect, for feeling like a contributing member of society. It's tied to dignity.
Okay, so it provides a foundation. What else makes a claim rise to the level of a right?
Well, sometimes it's about what's necessary for our well-being, our development. Think about the right to education. We see that as crucial for, developing your potential, understanding the world, participating fully in life. It's not just about survival, it's about flourishing.
So rights aren't just about protecting us from bad things, but also empowering us to, be our best selves.
In a way, yes, but there are definitely limits. The source material is quite clear on this.
Okay.
You can't claim a right to do something that's clearly harmful to your health and well-being, or maybe to others.
Ah, okay,
Don't-
like the examples they gave. Prohibited drugs or even smoking.
Exactly. Because these activities are generally recognized as injurious, you can't really make a justified claim that you have a right to do them, even if you want to. The potential harm outweighs the claim.
Got it. So my dream of claiming the right to own a pet dragon is probably out too. Shame.
The light chuckle. Probably best for everyone's safety, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Limits based on harm.
So the big question then,
Right.
where did this whole idea of rights actually come from? Did someone just invent it? Huh? Not quite. It's got a long history. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, the big idea was natural rights.
Natural rights. Okay, I've heard that term.
Yeah, the thinking then was that certain rights, like life, liberty, owning property, weren't granted by kings or governments. They came from, well, nature or maybe God.
So they were inherent
Yeah.
just by being human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Inherent and inalienable, meaning they couldn't legitimately be taken away. It was a really powerful idea for challenging rulers who thought they had absolute power.
I can see that. Like, you can't take this away. It's natural.
Precisely. But, language evolves, and so do ideas.
Yeah, so.
Well, the whole concept of natural law isn't as widely accepted now as the sole basis. Today, we talk much more about human rights.
Human rights. Okay, what's the shift there?
It's more focused on the idea that these are guarantees that we as human beings living together decide are essential for everyone to have, at minimum, a decent life.
So less about divine origin, maybe, and more about a shared human understanding.
Exactly. It's grounded in the belief that every single person has inherent value, inherent worth, and is equal just by virtue of being human. That basic equality is the foundation.
And this idea, the source mentions a free and equal self that's used to push back against unfairness.
Absolutely. If everyone is fundamentally equal and possesses this inherent worth, then you can't justify discrimination based on things like race or caste or religion or gender. It becomes a powerful tool to challenge those kinds of inequalities.
Right. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights fits in here somewhere.
It's a huge piece of the puzzle. The UN adopted it in 1948, and it basically reflects this global consensus. It's the world community coming together and saying, okay, these are the rights we believe are essential for everyone, everywhere to live with dignity and self-respect.
Like a global baseline.
Sort of, yeah. And it's important to remember that our understanding of what belongs on that list isn't static. It grows,
How does it grow?
often through the struggles of groups who've been excluded. Think about the fight against slavery or the women's suffrage movement. Their struggles force society to recognize the injustice and expand the understanding of who gets rights. And that continues.
So it's an ongoing process, and new challenges can lead to new ideas about rights, too, like environmental stuff.
Definitely. As we face new threats like climate change or pollution, people start demanding new rights, the right to clean air, the right to clean water, because these things directly impact our ability to live healthy, dignified lives.
Or like in crises, the right to basic necessities.
Exactly. It often comes from seeing a fundamental need not being met or a new threat to well-being and then articulating that as a right.
Now, you mentioned philosophical ideas earlier. The sources bring up Immanuel Kant and human dignity. How does he fit in?
Kant's idea is really influential here. He argued that humans are special because we have dignity and intrinsic worth. We're not just tools or objects.
So we shouldn't be used merely as a means to someone else's end.
Precisely. He said we should always treat people as ends in themselves, respect their autonomy, their ability to reason and make moral choices.
And that connects to rights. How?
It provides a strong moral foundation. It suggests that rights aren't just convenient social arrangements. They stem from this fundamental respect we owe each other simply because we are human beings with inherent dignity.
That's a powerful thought. Okay, so we have these moral arguments, this idea of inherent dignity. But how does that become something real, something enforceable?
That's where legal rights and the state come into the picture. Moral arguments are crucial. They build the foundation, but for rights to have real teeth, they generally need legal backing.
So we need laws.
We usually do, yes.
Yeah.
Recognition by the government and the legal system makes a huge difference. This is why many countries have a Bill of Rights baked into their constitution.
Like the fundamental rights in India, which the source mentioned.
Exactly. Putting rights in the Constitution makes them the highest law of the land. It means other laws and government actions have to comply with them. It gives them primary importance.
And sometimes these legally recognized rights reflect very specific historical issues in a country, like banning untouchability in India.
That's a perfect example. The universal principle is equality. But the specific law addresses a particular deep-rooted form of discrimination in that society.
Okay, now the source made an interesting point. Some define rights as claims recognized by the state, but it also said that's not necessarily where the claim starts.
Right, that's an important distinction. While legal recognition is often the goal and what makes a right practically effective, the claim itself often comes first, from people, from social movements.
So people demand a right based on fairness or morality before it's law.
Often, yes. Think about civil rights movements or demands for workers' rights. People were arguing they deserved these things based on justice and equality long before the laws fully caught up. The legal part often follows the social and moral push.
So the law codifies it, gives it power, but the initial spark comes from the people demanding it.
That's a good way to put it. And usually when people are demanding these rights, who are they directing that demand towards?
The state, the government.
Primarily, yes. Rights usually imply obligations on the state.
Obligations to do what?
Two main kinds, really. Sometimes it's an obligation to act. Like the right to education obliges the state to provide schools or resources.
Okay, positive action.
And sometimes it's an obligation not to act, to refrain from interfering. Like the right to free speech means the state shouldn't censor you unfairly. The right to liberty means the state can't just lock you up without cause.
So rights tell the state what it must do and what it must not do.
Exactly. It sets limits on state authority. It ensures the government exercises its power without violating individual life and liberty. Ultimately, the idea is that the state exists for the well-being of the people within it.
Got it. Rights as a framework for keeping state power in check and focused on the people.
That sums it up well.
Okay, so we understand the what and the why a bit better. Let's break down the different kinds of rights mentioned. Political, civil, economic, cultural. Sounds like a lot.
It can seem like it, but they connect. Let's start with political rights. These are probably the ones most people think of first in a democracy.
Like voting.
Exactly. The right to vote, the right to stand for election yourself, the right to form political parties or associations. They're all about participating in the political life of your country.
Giving people a say in how things are run.
Precisely. And then you have civil liberties, which are closely related.
How are they different from political rights?
Think of civil liberties as protecting your ability to exercise your political rights and live freely. So, things like the right to a free and fair trial, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to protest peacefully.
So political rights are about participation. Civil liberties are about the freedoms needed to participate and live without arbitrary interference.
You got it. They work together. You need free speech, a civil liberty, to effectively campaign for a candidate, a political right.
Makes sense, but the sources say these aren't always enough on their own, especially if people are struggling. That brings in economic rights.
Yes, this is a really important point. If someone is lacking basic necessities, food, shelter, healthcare, how effectively can they really participate in political life or enjoy their civil liberties?
Their priorities are elsewhere, understandably.
Exactly. So economic rights are about ensuring a basic standard of living. Things like the right to an adequate wage, reasonable working conditions, access to housing and medical care, maybe unemployment support if you lose your job.
It's about providing a safety net, a foundation.
A foundation,
Yeah.
exactly. The idea is that meeting these basic economic needs is crucial for people to actually make use of their other rights and live with dignity.
Okay, political, civil, economic, and the last one was cultural rights. What falls under that?
Cultural rights are about recognizing the importance of culture in people's lives. This includes things like the right to practice your own culture, speak your own language, maybe get education in your mother tongue, establish cultural institutions.
So it's about respecting diversity and identity.
Yes, respecting that diverse cultural expression is part of a good life for many people. It's become increasingly recognized as another essential dimension of human flourishing.
It definitely feels like the list of things considered rights has grown over time.
It absolutely has, especially in democracies. While the core rights, life, liberty, equality, political participation usually get priority, there's a growing understanding that other conditions are also necessary for a truly decent life.
Okay? Now, this is great, having all these rights. But it can't just be about what we get, can it? There must be a flip side. Responsibilities.
You're absolutely right. Rights always come with responsibilities. It's a two-way street.
What kind of responsibilities are we talking about?
Well, firstly, the sources mention an obligation on us as individuals to think beyond just ourselves, to consider the common good.
Like with the environment, my right to use resources doesn't mean I can trash the place.
Exactly. We have a responsibility to act in ways that sustain things for others, including future generations. That's one aspect.
Okay, what else?
Secondly, and this is crucial, we have to respect the rights of other people. My right to swing my fist ends where someone else's nose begins, as the saying goes.
Right. My freedom of expression doesn't give me the right to silence someone else or defame them unfairly.
Precisely. If I claim a right for myself, I have to grant that same right to others. It requires tolerance and mutual respect.
Makes sense. What's the third point?
Thirdly, we need to balance rights when they conflict. This is often the really tricky part.
Like the example given, freedom of expression versus someone's right to privacy.
Exactly. The media's right to report news might clash with an individual's right not to have their private life exposed. There aren't always easy answers. It requires careful judgment to find a fair balance.
So we have a responsibility to navigate those conflicts thoughtfully.
Yes. And fourthly, there's a responsibility to be vigilant. especially about how the state might limit our rights.
Vigilant how?
Well, governments sometimes argue they need to restrict rights, often in the name of national security.
Okay, that happens.
And while security is important, we have a responsibility to question whether those restrictions are truly necessary, proportionate, and not just an overreach of power. We need to watch out for measures that could erode civil liberties.
Like being arrested just on suspicion or wide-scale surveillance. The sources mentioned those.
Those are exactly the kinds of things that require scrutiny. Is the security gain worth the loss of liberty? Is there a less intrusive way? We need to be cautious about giving governments powers that could undermine the very freedoms we value.
Because it can be a slippery slope towards a less free society.
History suggests it certainly can be. So that vigilance is a key responsibility for citizens in a democracy. Rights need defending.
They really are the foundation, aren't they?
Absolutely. They underpin a democratic way of life.
Which brings us back again to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It seems like such a cornerstone document.
It truly is. Adopted by the UN way back in 1948, it serves as a common standard, a shared aspiration for all peoples and nations regarding human rights.
What's its core message?
The preamble really captures it. It talks about the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world.
That idea of inherent dignity again.
Yes. And it explicitly mentions that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. It was written in the shadow of World War II.
So it was a response to horrific events, a statement that this shouldn't happen again.
Exactly. It was an attempt to set a global standard to promote respect for these rights and freedoms everywhere through education and by encouraging countries to take progressive steps to make them a reality.
A benchmark for humanity in a way.
A very important one, yes.
Yeah.
Still highly relevant today.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from defining a right as a justified claim all the way to this global declaration. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And the key takeaway, I think, is that rights are these essential conditions for living with dignity and pursuing our well-being.
And where they come from is debated, but increasingly it's seen as tied to just being human, our inherent worth.
Right. And they come in different forms, political, civil, economic, cultural, all important.
But crucially, they come with responsibilities for the state to act or not act, and for us as individuals to respect others and the common good.
And it's not a finished story.
Mm-hmm.
Our understanding of rights keeps evolving as we face new challenges.
Absolutely. It makes you think. Well, this has been incredibly insightful, really breaking down what rights mean.
Glad we could dive into it. It's fundamental stuff.
Definitely. So, for everyone listening, here's something to chew on. Considering everything we've discussed, that balance between individual rights and what society needs, what do you think is the most pressing right that needs more attention, more protection in the world right now?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. Lots to think about. Until our next deep dive, keep questioning and stay curious.
We are deep diving into Chapter 6, Citizenship.
Citizenship. Sounds simple, but it's deep.
It really is. This chapter, it sort of unpacks what it means to be a full and equal member of a political community today, like beyond just having the paperwork, the actual experience.
That's it, exactly. It's one of those things you don't always think about if you have it,
Mm-hmm.
But it shapes so much.
So what are we looking at specifically?
We'll get into how it's understood, that link between the citizens and the nation, the criteria for becoming a citizen.
And then the flip side too, right? People without citizenship.
Definitely. The reality for stateless people, refugees. And then there's this newer idea, this concept of global citizenship.
Okay, so the mission for everyone listening is to get a clear handle on just how complex citizenship is in today's world. All the debates, the struggles.
Yeah, the different angles. Hopefully a better sense of what belonging really means now.
Right. So the chapter starts with that core definition. Citizenship is full and equal membership in a political community. Seems straightforward enough?
On the surface, yes. But then you ask, what is that political community in practice?
Usually the state, I guess.
That's generally it, yeah. The state provides that identity, being Indian or Japanese or German. It's tied to a state. And ideally, that comes with certain rights, protections.
Which you really notice when they're missing. The chapter mentions refugees, illegal migrants, people without that official state backing.
Exactly. Their situation can be incredibly precarious. They often lack guaranteed rights. The Palestinian refugees are a powerful example mentioned generations without that secure status.
It makes you realize how much we rely on it. We just expect certain things, don't we?
We do, like the right to vote, freedom of speech, maybe freedom of belief,
Yeah.
even access to basic things like healthcare or education, socioeconomic rights.
And the key word the chapter stresses is equality. Equal rights, equal status for everyone.
That's the ideal in democratic societies, absolutely.
But it wasn't always like this. These rights had to be fought for.
Oh, definitely. The chapter points to historical struggles against monarchies, fights for independence from colonial rule, where people demanded the same rights the colonizers had.
Like the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, ending relatively recently in the early 90s.
Precisely. Or even ongoing movements like the women's movement or the Dalit movement in India, pushing for that full equality, that full membership. It's a continuous process.
So that leads to the next section, 6.2, which asks, well, what does full and equal membership really mean day to day? It uses this analogy I think many can relate to.
The crowded train or bus.
Yeah, you squeeze on, find a spot, and suddenly you're like, okay, no more people, please.
Agrees. You become an insider very quickly. It's a simple picture, but it captures that tension, that insider versus outsider feeling.
And that plays out on a larger scale, doesn't it? Cities, regions. When resources feel tight, jobs, healthcare, land, water, you hear these calls to keep outsiders out.
Even if they're citizens from another part of the same country, the chapter mentions the Mumbai for Mumbai cars slogan as one example. But you see similar things elsewhere in India and globally, too.
It really forces the question, does full and equal membership mean you have the right to live, study, work anywhere in the country?
Logically, you'd think so, but it gets messy fast when local pressures mount.
Yeah, because freedom of movement is vital for the economy, isn't it? People need to go where the jobs are.
Absolutely. IT workers moving to Bangalore, nurses from Kerala finding work across the country, construction workers following projects. It's essential.
But then you get resistance from locals, worries about wages, jobs going to outsiders, maybe language differences.
And those concerns, while sometimes based on prejudice, can feel very real to the people experiencing the changes. It's a difficult balance. Is it ever okay to restrict movement within a country?
Tough question. No easy answer there.
It also makes you think about how we react differently, maybe. We might get upset if Indian workers face poor treatment abroad, but sometimes resent outsiders within our own borders, especially if they're perceived as poorer or less skilled. Do we really believe in equal rights for all workers?
That's a challenging thought. So, how do democracies handle these tensions?
Well, the chapter outlines the usual democratic processes: peaceful protest, organizing groups, using the media, engaging political parties, appealing to the courts.
So it's about finding ways to resolve disputes.
Ideally, yes, through negotiation, discussion. The courts might make a decision or push the government, but the emphasis is on working things out. It's part of being a citizen, engaging in that process.
And the chapter leaves us with some things to chew on, these let's think questions. Like, should there be total freedom of movement? Should long-term residents get preference? What about quotas for students?
Yeah, real-world dilemmas stemming directly from this idea of equal membership.
Okay, so section 6.3 then shifts gears slightly, focusing more on the socioeconomic dimension. Does citizenship guarantee a basic standard of living? For everyone.
Rich or poor, yeah. Does being a citizen mean you have a right to certain basic necessities, a minimum quality of life?
And the example used is the urban poor in India, slum dwellers, squatters.
Right. People who often provide vital services. They're hawkers, traders, domestic workers, construction workers, yet they're frequently seen as unwelcome.
Living in incredibly tough conditions, too. Overcrowded, lacking sanitation, insecure.
And often with little public investment in their areas, despite their economic contributions.
But the chapter notes there's growing awareness, right? Efforts by governments, NGOs.
Yes, and importantly by the slum dwellers themselves, organizing, demanding rights, even going to the courts. The mention of the national policy for urban street vendors in 2004 shows a move towards recognition and protection.
It even affects basic political rights, like voting, if you don't have a fixed address.
Absolutely. And it's not just the urban poor. The chapter also touches on the marginalization of tribal peoples and forest dwellers.
Facing pressure from population growth, resource extraction, commercial interests.
Exactly. Mining, tourism, and the government trying to balance development with protecting these communities and environments. It's complex.
And a key point here is that equal rights doesn't always mean identical treatment.
Precisely. True equality might mean tailoring policies to meet the different needs of different groups. You have to consider the context.
This connects to the ideas of T.H. Marshall, the sociologist.
Yes, from his 1950 work, Citizenship and Social Class. He defines citizenship as basically being a full member of the community with equal rights and duties
And he broke down those rights.
into three types. Civil rights like life, liberty, property, political rights, participation, voting, and social rights, access to education, employment, things needed for a dignified life.
So for Marshall, citizenship was a way to kind of level the playing field, counteract class division.
Sort of, yeah. To create a baseline of equality and belonging, fostering a more integrated community despite economic differences.
And the chapter connects this to a specific case in India. Olga, tell us.
The 1985 Supreme Court case, yes, it was significant because the court interpreted the right to life under Article 21 really broadly.
How so?
They said it included the right to livelihood. So if you evict pavement dwellers without providing an alternative, you're essentially taking away their means of survival, which violates their right to life.
Wow, that's a powerful interpretation, linking dignity and survival directly to constitutional rights.
It is, and it reinforces the chapter's point that citizenship isn't static. It's meaning the rights involved, they evolve with society, with the economy, but the goal should remain equal rights and protection for everyone.
Makes sense. And there's suggestions for listeners, too, surveying local workers, thinking about land issues like in Zimbabwe, checking out the Street Vendors Act.
Lots of ways to connect these ideas to the real world.
Okay, let's turn to section 6.4, Citizen and Nation. This gets into that relationship.
Right, how the idea of the citizen developed alongside the modern nation-state. The French Revolution was a key moment asserting national sovereignty, the rights of citizens of the nation.
And nation-states define themselves by territory, but also by culture. Shared history.
Yeah, a unique culture, a common history, often expressed through symbols, the flag, anthem, national language, ceremonies. It builds that sense of collective identity.
But most states today are super diverse. So how does that work?
Well, democratic states aim for an inclusive national identity, one that embraces diversity. But, in practice,
It's easier for some groups to fit in than others.
it can be. And that can influence who the state readily grants citizenship to. The chapter mentions the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, but even there are complexities.
France is used as another example, secular, inclusive in principle.
But expecting assimilation in public life, respecting private beliefs, but wanting a shared public culture, which leads to controversies.
It's like the debates over Sikh turbans or Muslim headscarves in schools.
Exactly. It shows the tension. And assimilation itself is easier for some groups than others.
And the rules for getting citizenship vary wildly too, don't they?
Hugely. Some countries, like Israel or historically Germany, have criteria linked to religion or ethnicity. The chapter mentions the debate in Germany about citizenship for kids of Turkish guest workers born and raised there. It's a live issue.
How about India? The chapter describes it as secular, democratic.
Born out of a very broad independence movement that tried to unite diverse peoples. Despite partition, the Constitution aimed for an inclusive, secular nation.
And the Constitution specifically tries to accommodate diversity.
Yes, through provisions for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, regional minorities, different languages, religions, granting equal rights without demanding people give up their personal identities. The Republic Day Parade is mentioned as a symbol of this.
So legally, how does one become an Indian citizen?
Part 2 of the Constitution and later laws cover it. Birth, descent, registration, naturalization, or incorporation of territory. And crucially, discrimination based on religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth is prohibited. Minority rights are protected.
But even with these provisions, struggles continue.
Oh, absolutely. The chapter mentions movements by women, Dalits, displaced people. It underscores that democratic citizenship isn't a finished product. It's constantly being negotiated. New demands arise.
Always evolving. And there's a let's debate prompt about school uniforms and religious symbols to get people thinking about those boundaries.
Keeps the mind working.
Definitely. Now, Section 6.5 takes us into tougher territory. Universal citizenship. Thinking about refugees, migrants.
Yeah, the images are stark, aren't they? People smuggled across borders, displaced by war or famine in Darfur, Palestinians, Rohingya, Bangladeshis fleeing poverty.
People forced from their homes, becoming refugees internally or crossing borders.
And the chapter raises this kind of baseline expectation that people living and working somewhere or applying formally should ideally get membership.
But the reality is different. States control their borders.
They do. Even while advocating for inclusive citizenship conceptually, states set criteria and restrict entry. It's a fundamental power they exercise.
And migration continues regardless, driven by conflict, persecution, famine.
Which leads to this tragic group. Stateless people, refugees in camps, undocumented migrants, often unable to legally work, send kids to school, own property. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees exists because this problem is so massive.
It puts states in a bind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Balancing humanitarian concerns with security, economic pressures.
Yeah.
How many refugees can or should they accept?
It's a huge dilemma. India, for instance, has sheltered refugees like the Dalai Lama and Tibetans, but there's also the ongoing issue mentioned of people from neighboring countries living stateless within India for years, limited access to citizenship.
Which challenges that ideal of democratic citizenship providing rights and identity for all.
It really does. Statelessness is a major global problem. People lose homes, identities, security because of wars, political disputes. Can national citizenship alone solve this?
Or do we need something more? A more universal identity?
That's the question that leads into the idea of global citizenship, and listeners are prompted to research stateless people in India specifically.
Right. So the final section, 6.6, Global Citizenship. How does the chapter introduce this?
It starts with examples of our interconnectedness. The global response to the tsunami, international terror networks, fighting pandemics together.
Things that show events elsewhere affect us all.
Exactly. New communications tech means we know about things instantly, often feel empathy, a shared concern across borders.
And proponents of global citizenship build on this.
They argue that this feeling of connection already exists. The tsunami aid is a prime example. They say we should strengthen this into a clearer concept of global citizenship.
Because maybe national rights aren't enough anymore.
That's the question posed. With problems like climate change, pandemics, massive migration flows that cross borders, are state-based rights sufficient? Do we need to think more in terms of universal human rights and global citizenship?
And one big plus could be helping migrants and stateless people.
Potentially, yes. A global framework could ensure basic rights and protection everywhere, regardless of nationality.
But the chapter doesn't say national citizenship is irrelevant now.
No, not at all. It stresses that national citizenship is still vital. Many socioeconomic problems are best tackled locally and nationally.
So global citizenship is more like an addition, a supplement.
That seems to be the idea. It complements national citizenship. It fosters awareness of our interconnectedness, the need for cooperation to solve global challenges. And again, there's a suggestion to look into global citizenship education via UNESCO.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Chapter 6 on citizenship, quite a journey.
It really is. We've seen it's complex, dynamic, it covers national belonging, the fight for equal rights, the huge issue of statelessness, and this emerging idea of global belonging.
And that phrase, full and equal membership, it's clearly still a work in progress, a struggle in many places.
Constantly being debated, challenged, reshaped.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe, for our listeners.
Yeah, perhaps this. In our world, so interconnected, facing huge shared problems, climate, health, inequality, how should citizenship evolve? Do we stick mainly to the national model, or does global citizenship need to become a much stronger focus to ensure everyone has dignity and security?
Something to definitely keep thinking about.
You've tuned in for another deep dive, and today we are deep diving into Chapter 7, Nationalism.
Ah, nationalism, a big one.
Definitely. Now, you encounter nationalism in so many ways, don't you? Maybe cheering for your country in the Olympics, or perhaps feeling that connection with someone from back home when you're traveling.
Oh, for sure, that shared recognition.
It's this really powerful, often kind of invisible force shaping our world. Think about how countries form, how they sometimes break apart. Nationalism is right there, smack bang in the middle of it all.
That's absolutely right. It's a force that's been, reshaping the global map for centuries. Empires rising and falling on these tides of national feeling. And even now you see movements pushing for new countries or redrawing existing borders. It clearly has a massive impact on, well, all of us.
Exactly. And while you probably have a sense of what nationalism is, maybe it's that rush of pride when your national cricket team hits a six.
Yeah, or maybe seeing a familiar film abroad.
Or that shared smile with a stranger when you both recognize a line from, say, a Bollywood film actually pinning down a precise definition. That can feel like trying to catch smoke.
It can. It's slippery.
But because it's such a big deal, we really need to understand what's going on beneath the surface, you know?
Definitely. And what's fascinating right from the start is that nationalism isn't always what first springs to mind. When we really dig into what makes a nation and how that connects to nationalism, well, some of our initial ideas might just get turned on their head.
Okay, so let's start right there then. What exactly is a nation? Because honestly, when I think nation, my mind goes to things like people speaking the same language or sharing a similar background, that kind of thing.
It's a common first thought,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's also where we can easily go, well, a bit wrong. A nation isn't just any random group of people.
Right.
And it's definitely not the same as the connections you have with family or even like a close-knit tribe where everyone knows each other personally.
Mhm.
The reality is, most people within a nation will never actually meet face-to-face. Millions of them.
That's kind of mind-blowing when you actually stop and think about it. You feel this strong sense of belonging to millions of people you've never even laid eyes on. So, okay, it's not about those personal connections. But surely those shared things, language, religion, they must play a key role.
They can be factors, for sure, but they aren't what strictly defines a nation. Look at Canada, for instance. You've got both English and French as official languages.
Good point.
Or think about India, with its incredible diversity of languages and religions. Neither fits neatly into a box of one language or one faith.
Right.
And the same goes for the idea that everyone has to have a shared ancestry or ethnicity. It's simply not a universal requirement for being a nation.
So if it's not these obvious things, what's the glue then? What holds a nation together? What makes it a nation?
Okay, this is where the concept of a nation as an imagined community comes in. It's quite influential.
Imagined community sounds a bit abstract.
It means it's not about everyone knowing each other personally. Instead, it's about sharing a set of beliefs, maybe aspirations for the future, and crucially, a shared sense of belonging that exists primarily in people's minds.
Ah, okay. So it's like a collective mindset.
Pretty much. It's the feeling that you're part of something bigger than yourself, even if you don't personally know everyone else in that group. So the key insight here is that nations aren't necessarily about shared blood or soil, but maybe more about shared belief, that powerful idea of an imagined community that we all sort of buy into.
An imagined community. That's a fascinating way to put it. Like we're all implicitly agreeing to believe in the same story.
Precisely. And a vital part of that story is, well, a set of shared beliefs. A nation exists, unlike, say, a mountain, because its people believe it exists.
Right. It's not a physical thing in the same way.
Exactly. It's not about ticking off a list of common traits like language or religion, though those can contribute. It's more about that collective identity and often a shared vision, including the desire for their own political setup, their own state.
Like your sports team example earlier.
Yeah, think about supporting your favorite sports team. Again, it only really exists as a team because the players and the fans believe they are a unit, right? If that belief disappears, the team, in that meaningful sense, just dissolves.
That makes total sense. I remember once I was at a football match, not really paying close attention, and someone next to me got genuinely annoyed I wasn't cheering loudly enough after a goal.
The expectation.
Yeah. There was this instant assumption that because we were, from the same country, I should automatically share this intense level of support. That shared national identity created this immediate expectation of behavior.
That's a perfect snapshot of how that shared belief works in practice.
Mm-hmm.
And another really important piece of this imagined community is a shared understanding of history.
Ah, yes, the stories we tell ourselves about where we've come from, the collective memory bank, sort of.
Exactly that. Nations construct a narrative of their past. They draw on shared memories, the good, the bad, the ugly, plus legends, historical accounts, to create this sense of a continuous identity, one that stretches from way back in the past through the present and projects into the future.
So it gives you roots.
It does. For instance, during the Indian independence movement, leaders constantly referred back to India's ancient civilizations, its long history, to argue for its continuous existence as a nation, despite all the surface diversity. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote about that tremendous impress of oneness he felt held people together across centuries.
So it's about having this common backstory, even if, most of us weren't actually around for 99% of it. It creates that feeling of we've been through this together, but on the massive national scale. Okay, what's the next ingredient in this national recipe?
Territory is usually another key element. Nations tend to have a really strong connection to a specific geographical area, right? Often referred to with quite emotionally charged terms like homeland, motherland, fatherland, sometimes even holy land. That shared history of living together on a particular piece of land for a long time that really strengthens the sense of collective identity.
It's like putting down roots together nationally.
Yeah, exactly. You can see the incredibly strong emotional bonds people have with their country's landscape, its physical features.
Absolutely. The symbolic importance of certain rivers or mountains in a national identity, it's huge.
Precisely. Think about the enduring connection of the Jewish people to the land of Palestine, even after centuries in diaspora, or the profound way the Indian nation identifies with its incredibly diverse geography. These are powerful
That
examples.
also sounds like a source of conflict.
Oh, definitely. As you can imagine, when you have different groups all claiming the same piece of land as their sacred homeland, well, it can very easily become a major source of conflict. Land is finite, right? And when it's so deeply tied to identity, disputes are almost inevitable.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've got shared beliefs, a common historical narrative, and a strong connection to a specific territory. Is there anything else that's like essential for a nation to form?
Yes, shared political ideals are also incredibly important, especially when we think about modern nations.
Mm.
What often sets apart a group that sees itself as a nation and, crucially, wants to become a state is a shared vision for how they should be governed.
So, how they want society to work.
Exactly. And a collective desire for political independence. It's about agreeing on the fundamental principles and values that should guide their society. Things like democracy, perhaps secularism, liberty, equality before the law.
The ground rules.
Yes, these shared ideals become the bedrock of their political identity as a nation, the rules of the game they all agree or aspire to play by. So it's not just about feeling a cultural connection, it's also about agreeing on how we want to organize our shared life politically.
So, it's like saying, look, we're not just a bunch of people living near each other. We share a vision for our future, and importantly, we want to control our own destiny.
That's a great way to put it. And particularly in a democratic setup, this shared commitment to a set of political values and ideals, often laid out in something like a constitution, is generally seen as the strongest foundation for a nation state
Why is that?
because it emphasizes the responsibility citizens have towards each other, stemming from the recognition of everyone's fundamental rights. A nation, in this modern sense, becomes stronger when its people actively uphold these shared civic obligations.
That really clicks, especially in a diverse country.
Yeah.
Because I can see how leaning too heavily on a shared cultural identity, like saying everyone has to follow one specific religion or speak one specific language, could cause serious problems, right? It could become quite exclusionary very quickly.
Absolutely. It's a potential minefield. While shared cultural aspects can certainly bring people together, trying to build a national identity solely on that in a diverse society is often, well, a recipe for trouble. Well, for one thing, major religions are rarely monolithic, are they? They have different branches, interpretations, levels of practice. Trying to tie a national identity rigidly to a single religion could easily lead to the oppression of those who don't fit that specific mold, or even minorities within that same religion,
You'd end up marginalizing people.
or worse. And secondly, most modern countries are a mix of cultures, aren't they? You have people from different backgrounds, different languages living side by side. If you force a single cultural identity, say one language as the price of belonging, you inevitably exclude many groups.
Right, limiting their freedoms or putting those who don't speak the national language at a disadvantage in jobs, education, everything.
Exactly. And that goes against the core democratic principles of equality and liberty for all citizens.
Hmm.
So in a diverse democracy, it's generally seen as much healthier, much more stable to build that national identity around those shared political values,
Mhm.
loyalty to a constitution, the rights and principles it protects, rather than trying to impose a single, uniform cultural identity.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Protect the process, the rights, rather than enforce a specific culture.
That's the central idea, yes. Now, once a group of people identifies as a nation with these shared beliefs, history, territory, and maybe political ideals, what often naturally follows is the desire for national self-determination.
And that's the big one, isn't it? The political goal, the idea that a nation should have the right to rule itself.
Precisely. National self-determination, in its simplest form, is the right of a nation to govern itself and decide its own future without outside interference. To make that real, a nation will typically seek recognition from the rest of the world, the international community, as an independent political entity, basically, as a state.
So it's like a nation saying, okay, we are who we are, we're distinct, and we want to be in charge of our own affairs now. Recognize us.
Exactly. These kinds of demands usually come from groups who feel they have that long history of living together in a specific area, that shared land connection we talked about, and who share that strong sense of common identity. Sometimes this desire is also linked quite explicitly to wanting to protect or even give special status, privilege to their particular culture.
We saw a lot of that push in 19th century Europe, right? The whole idea of one culture, one state. It sounds neat and tidy on paper, maybe?
That idea really took hold in the 19th century, yeah. And it played a huge role in how the map of Europe was redrawn after World War I, particularly with the Treaty of Versailles. The goal, at least in theory, was to create new independent countries based on cultural and linguistic lines, matching the state to the supposed nation.
Which sounds logical, maybe even fair in theory, let every cultural group have its own state. But I can imagine it caused quite a few headaches in reality. Things are never that neat.
Headaches is putting it mildly. It was incredibly messy. While it did grant political independence to some groups who genuinely desired it, which was positive for them, it also led to huge forced migrations. People suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of newly drawn borders.
Millions uprooted.
Millions uprooted from homes their families had lived in for generations. And tragically, it also fueled a lot of communal violence between different groups who are now either forced together or competing for dominance in these new states. Trying to neatly align culture and statehood came at a terrible human cost.
And even then, these new states weren't always perfectly uniform culturally, were they? They still had minorities.
Almost never. You'd still have significant minority groups within those new borders who then might feel alienated or oppressed themselves. So it almost feels like trying to solve one problem, lack of self-determination for some, and ending up creating a whole bunch of new ones, particularly minority problems.
Yeah, it's complex. Now, you mentioned the Basque region in Spain earlier as an example of a group seeking national self-determination. Can you tell us a bit more about that specific situation?
Sure. The Basque Country, or Euskadi, is a region in northern Spain, quite hilly, relatively prosperous. They currently have a significant level of autonomy within the Spanish state.
So they have some self-government already.
Yes, quite a bit. However, there are Basque nationalists who advocate for full independence, becoming a completely separate country. They've used both political means and, historically, some groups resorted to violent methods to try and achieve this goal.
Okay, so what are their main arguments for wanting to be a separate nation? What makes them feel so distinct from the rest of Spain?
They really emphasize their unique culture, and especially their language, Euskara. It's fascinating because it's not related to Spanish or French or any other Romance language nearby. It's an isolate. Yeah. And even though maybe only around a third of the population speaks it fluently these days, it remains a very powerful symbol of their distinct identity. They also point to the region's unique geography, the mountains, and a long history of having a degree of self-rule. They argue they were never fully absorbed into Spain in the same way as some other regions, maintaining their own legal and administrative systems, called fueros, for centuries.
So they have this strong sense of historical and cultural separateness, backed by language and a history of autonomy. What's the current situation? Is the push for independence still strong, or has the autonomy they have now dampened it?
Well, the modern Basque nationalist movement really gathered steam back in the late 19th century when the central Spanish government tried to centralize power and reduce that special status, those fueros.
Ah, so a reaction to centralization.
Precisely. And things got much worse in the 20th century under the dictator Franco. He really cracked down hard on regional autonomy across Spain and specifically targeted Basque identity, even banning the public use of the Basque language.
That must have fueled resentment massively.
Hugely. Now, those repressive measures are long gone. Spain is a democracy, and the region enjoys considerable self-governance, as we said. But there's still a lingering sense of suspicion among some Basque nationalists, a fear of losing their distinct identity within the larger Spanish state. So it's definitely not a completely settled issue. And this brings up some really interesting questions for us and for you listening, doesn't it? Are Basque nationalists justified in demanding a separate nation? Based on everything we've discussed about what makes a nation's shared beliefs, history, territory ideals, is Basque actually a nation? What other information would you feel you need to form your own opinion on that?
It really does make you think. You've got their historical arguments, their unique culture, but then you weigh that against the potential disruption, the costs of creating a brand new state, maybe creating new minorities within that. And you can see similar dynamics playing out in various parts of the world, can't you? Even within long-established countries, you often have groups pushing for more autonomy or even full separation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Think about the national liberation movements across Asia and Africa that fought so hard for independence from colonial powers in the 20th century. Their drive for self-determination was fundamentally about gaining dignity, gaining recognition on the world stage, and of course, protecting their own collective
The
interests.
desire for freedom and respect.
Absolutely. And while many of them did achieve statehood, it often wasn't possible or practical for every single cultural group that identified as a nation to get its own state, which, unfortunately, has led to ongoing border disputes and internal conflicts in many parts of the post-colonial world.
And then there's that paradox you mentioned.
Right, it's almost a paradoxical situation. You see these newly independent nation-states
Yeah.
having fought tooth and nail for their own self-determination, often then vigorously resisting similar movements within their own newly drawn borders.
It's like, we got ours, pull up the drawbridge, you guys can't have yours.
It's a common and very complex dynamic, often driven by fears of disintegration or losing territory. But there's also a growing recognition, perhaps, that creating ever more new states isn't always the best answer.
Why not?
Well, it can be incredibly challenging economically and politically, especially for smaller regions. And as we've seen with the post-WBI experience, it can often just create new minority problems within the new state. Because of this, there's been a bit of a shift in focus internationally and academically
Towards what?
towards making existing states more democratic, more inclusive, finding ways to ensure that diverse cultural and ethnic groups can coexist as equal partners within the current state structure, rather than just splitting off. Respecting the rights of minorities is now increasingly seen not as a weakness, but potentially as a way to actually strengthen a nation-state in the long run.
Okay, so if we move away or try to temper this idea of one culture, one state, how do we actually make sure that different cultures and communities can genuinely flourish within a single country? How do we make that pluralism work in practice?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And that's where the concept of pluralism really comes into its own. Democratic societies have developed various ways to try and recognize and protect the identities of cultural minority communities.
Like what sort of ways?
Well, the Indian Constitution, for example, is often cited here. It has a whole range of provisions specifically designed to safeguard the rights of religious, linguistic, and cultural minorities.
Right, we see things like constitutional protections for minority languages, allowing them to be used in education or government in certain regions, or protections for religious practices.
Exactly. And sometimes you even see measures like guaranteed representation for certain minority groups in legislative bodies or government positions. These are often referred to as group rights or minority rights.
What's the thinking behind granting these kinds of specific group rights? Why not just focus on individual rights for everyone?
That's a good question. The rationale often put forward is that these group-specific rights are essential to ensure that members of minority groups receive genuinely equal treatment and legal protection in practice, not just on paper. And also, crucially, to safeguard their unique cultural identities from being unintentionally or intentionally overwhelmed or assimilated by the dominant majority culture.
So it's about creating a level playing field, culturally speaking.
Kind of. The underlying idea is that when all cultural communities within a state feel valued, feel their contributions are recognized, and their identity is secure, it leads to a more inclusive, more stable, and ultimately stronger national identity overall. It's about building a national identity that's more like a vibrant tapestry, maybe, where each distinct thread, each different culture, contributes to the richness and beauty of the whole cloth.
That's a great analogy. Like each different pattern makes the whole thing richer, more interesting. But even with these kinds of protections in place, do some groups still continue to push for their own independent state anyway? Does pluralism always satisfy nationalists' demands?
No, not always. Absolutely. Despite the increasing interconnectedness of the world, globalization, the internet, all that nationalist aspirations remain a really powerful driving force for many communities. The desire to have their own flag, their own seat at the UN, their own distinct voice on the world stage, that can be a very, very strong pull.
Which brings us, I think, to the perspective of Rabindranath Tagore. He was obviously a towering figure in the Indian independence movement, a Nobel laureate, but he also had some quite critical, nuanced views on nationalism itself, didn't he? He wasn't just a straightforward nationalist.
He did indeed. Tagore was, without question, a fierce opponent of British colonial rule and firmly believed in India's right to self-governance, to Swaraj. However, and this is key, he was very careful to distinguish between opposing Western imperialism and rejecting Western civilization entirely.
Ah, that's an important distinction.
Very. He believed that India should absolutely stay true to its own rich cultural roots and heritage, but it should also remain open to learning from and taking what was valuable from other parts of the world, including the West. So he wasn't advocating for isolationism. He was against being dominated, but not against engaging with other cultures.
So his issue wasn't really with the fundamental idea of India being independent, but perhaps with the kind of nationalism that might emerge in the process of achieving it.
Exactly that. A recurring theme in his writings, his lectures, his poems was a critique of what he often called patriotism, particularly its narrow, exclusionary forms, which he saw emerging within the Indian independence movement itself.
What worried him about it?
He was deeply concerned that a wholesale rejection of everything associated with the West, born out of anti-colonial struggle, could easily spill over into hostility towards other foreign influences that had become deeply interwoven into India's fabric over centuries. Things like Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Islam.
Ah, so he feared it could become xenophobic.
He feared a kind of inward-looking, defensive nationalism that could become intolerant and shut itself off from the rest of humanity, defining itself only by what it wasn't, rather than by positive, inclusive values.
Right, defining itself by who it's against rather than what it's for. That can be dangerous.
Precisely. He famously said, and it's a powerful quote, "Patriotism cannot be our final spiritual shelter. My refuge is humanity. I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity as long as I live."
Wow. My refuge is humanity.
Yeah. For Tagore, any narrow, exclusive form of nationalism, however understandable its origins, was ultimately a dangerous path. He felt it could betray fundamental, universal human values. He placed a higher value on our shared humanity than on any single national identity. That's a pretty profound challenge to conventional thinking, isn't it? It really makes you consider where our ultimate loyalties should lie.
It really does hit you hard. It makes you think about the potential downsides, the shadows of even the most well-intentioned national pride or patriotism.
It absolutely does. And it underscores the importance of being thoughtful, maybe generous, certainly careful, when democratic societies grapple with demands for self-determination. The understanding of that right, the right to national self-determination, has evolved quite a bit over time.
How so?
Well, it's no longer automatically viewed in international law or political theory as a guaranteed right to independent statehood for every single group that identifies itself as a nation.
Because, as we discussed, that can be impractical.
Exactly. Because, as we've discussed, that one culture, one state approach can often be impractical, potentially creating tiny, non-viable states and frequently leading to even more complex minority problems down the line. So instead, the focus is increasingly shifted towards ensuring meaningful democratic rights, cultural recognition, and perhaps significant autonomy for different nationalities within existing state structures.
So finding ways to live together rather than just splitting apart.
That's the hope, or at least the pragmatic direction many are looking towards. We live in a world where recognizing diverse identities is becoming increasingly important, globally conscious. And many groups continue to use the language of nationalism to voice their aspirations, their grievances, their hopes.
And those voices need to be heard.
Absolutely. It's crucial to acknowledge these claims, understand their historical and social roots. But at the same time, we also need to be incredibly careful, vigilant, even to prevent these identity claims from escalating into division, hatred, and ultimately violence. It's a really, really delicate balancing act.
It feels like walking a tightrope, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between acknowledging people's deep need for identity and belonging, their distinctiveness, and ensuring we don't just fracture society into a million tiny, warring pieces.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And
Yeah.
we need to constantly remember, perhaps, that individuals aren't just one thing. We all have multiple layers to our identity, don't we? Based on things like our gender, our class or profession, our religion or lack thereof, our language, the region we come from, our family roles.
So many things make us who we are.
Exactly. And arguably, a healthy democracy should be a space that allows for the free expression of all these different facets of who we are without one single identity like national identity constantly needing to become a political demand for separation or dominance over others. The real danger, maybe, lies in those forms of identity politics and nationalism that are intolerant, that try to force everyone into a single homogeneous mold, denying that rich complexity.
So to try and bring this all together then, we've really taken quite a deep dive today into the very complex, multifaceted world of nationalism. We've seen it's so much more than just flags and anthems.
Much more.
At its core is this idea of a nation that imagined community, as we called it, often built on shared beliefs, a common understanding of history, whether accurate or not, a connection to territory, and maybe some shared political ideals.
Hmm.
We've explored how the pursuit of national self-determination has dramatically reshaped our world, leading to independence for many, but also causing immense conflict and suffering.
Both sides of the coin.
And we've seen why navigating that tricky relationship between nationalist aspirations and the principles of pluralism, letting different cultures thrive together, is so vital, especially in diverse societies like so many are today.
Absolutely crucial.
And Tagore's powerful critique, well, that serves as a really important reminder to always try and keep a broader perspective, perhaps, on our shared humanity beyond just our national box.
It's a continuous process, isn't it, of discussion, negotiation, trying to find mutual understanding. No easy answers.
Definitely not. Well, you, our listener, have been right there with us on this journey through nationalism. And maybe here's a final thought to ponder, something building on Tagore's wisdom. In a world that feels like it's becoming ever more interconnected, technology, travel, trade, yet remains so obviously deeply influenced by national loyalties and sentiments, how do you see the balance shifting? That balance between feeling pride in your nation, your belonging, and embracing a wider sense of, I don't know, global citizenship or just basic human connection. What does it truly mean to belong in the 21st century?
That's a great question to leave people with.
We really encourage you to think about the examples we've touched on, the complexities, say, of Basque nationalism, the profound insights of someone like Tagore, and just consider how these big ideas about nations and belonging play out in your own life and in the world you see around you every day. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
We are deep diving into Chapter 8, Secularism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you've got a country, buzzing with all sorts of different cultures, different communities,
Mm-hmm.
how does a democratic government make sure everyone gets a fair go?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is, and that's the big one this chapter tackles. Seems straightforward, maybe, but here in India, it's got more twists and turns than you'd expect.
You've hit the nail on the head there. What's immediately striking and kind of a puzzle is that almost every politician, every party in India, they all say they're secular. You hear the word constantly.
Absolutely.
But then you scratch the surface just a little and you find secularism in India is, well, it's constantly bumping up against challenges from all sides, really. It's
Yeah.
clear it's a concept that's still very much alive and contested, a work in progress.
Absolutely. So our mission today, if you're sticking with us,
Which we hope you are.
is to really get under the hood of what secularism actually means. We want to see why it's so vital for India, maybe tackle some of those nagging doubts and criticisms you hear,
Yeah, the common ones.
and ultimately figure out why it's such a key ingredient for any democracy worth its salt. We'll be wrestling with questions like, what is secularism, really? Is it just some, hand-me-down from the West?
That old chestnut.
Can it even work in societies where religion plays such a big role day to day? Does it unfairly tip the scales for minorities? And is it secretly anti-religion?
Big questions.
Huge questions. And we're diving in, and it's crucial to realize right away, this isn't just some abstract philosophical thing. The chapter throws you straight into the deep end with some really sobering real-world examples.
Yeah, it does.
Things that just shout out why secularism is still so essential everywhere. We're talking discrimination against Arab minorities in Israel, the sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle biases non-Christians face in Europe.
And, I mean, the truly worrying situation for religious minorities right next door in Pakistan and Bangladesh, these aren't just history lessons.
No, they're happening now. And bringing it closer to home, the chapter, it doesn't pull any punches about India's own difficult moments. Moments that really underscore why secularism isn't just a nice idea, it's a necessity.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're talking about the 1984 Sikh massacre, the heartbreaking displacement of Hindu Kashmiri Pandits, the horrific Gujarat riots in 2002.
Yeah, tough examples.
Really tough. And the gut-wrenching thing in all of them is that people were targeted, hurt, killed simply because of their religion. Basic rights just thrown out the window.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, of what happens when one religious group tries to dominate others. Interreligious domination.
Exactly. And that's the first really important point the chapter lays out. Secularism, at its core, is about saying a firm no to all forms of that. One religion bossing another around.
Making sure no group can force its beliefs or discriminate. But then, almost immediately, the chapter pivots to something equally important.
Which is,
Domination within a religion itself. intra-religious domination.
Ah, okay. So not just between groups, but inside them too.
Precisely. This is where it gets maybe even more complex, like finding out the superhero has an internal struggle too.
Totally. Because, you know, when we think about religion and conflict, our minds usually jump to clashes between faiths,
Yeah.
right? Hindus versus Muslims, Christians versus Jews, whatever.
That's the common image.
But the chapter points out that there can be serious problems brewing inside religions too. It touches on that old saying about religion being an opium of the masses.
Right.
Quickly clarify that secularism isn't about, like, trashing religion altogether. It acknowledges that people have this deep need to make sense of suffering, of life's big questions.
And religion is one way people do that.
Just like art or philosophy, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a human response.
What's fascinating here is realizing that while religion can be a source of comfort, meaning, all that, it's not immune to internal power struggles. The chapter brings up really crucial issues like gender inequality. Still a huge problem in many religions.
Definitely.
And it shines a light on discrimination faced by certain groups within a faith. Think about Dalits historically barred from Hindu temples, or restrictions on women entering certain sacred sites even today.
And you also have the influence of very conservative factions, right? And the whole issue of religious fundamentalism.
Exactly. These internal dynamics can be incredibly oppressive.
It's a crucial point then. Secularism isn't just keeping the peace between different flags. It's also about challenging unfairness within those groups, like a referee stepping in when one part of the team is fouling another part.
Well put. If a religious group consistently denies basic rights to some of its own members, that's a form of domination too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So the chapter starts painting a clearer picture. Secularism isn't just passive, it's a normative doctrine.
Okay, what does that mean exactly? Normative doctrine.
Think of it like a set of guiding principles, a vision for what society should be like. It aims for a society free from both interreligious domination, one group lording it over another, and intra-religious domination, oppression happening inside a single group.
Okay.
And positively, it's about promoting freedom within religions and equality between and within them.
Okay, so we're getting a handle on the goals, freedom and equality, both between and within. But how does a society actually, make that happen?
Good question. And that leads naturally to the role of the state, the government.
Right.
The chapter acknowledges that things like good education, people just being decent to each other, those definitely help build harmony.
But they might not be enough on their own.
Probably not, especially not when you're dealing with really deep-rooted religious discrimination in complex modern societies. The power of the state becomes crucial.
How so?
Well, governments today wield enormous influence, right? How they use that power, laws, policies, enforcement, has a massive impact on whether we can actually reduce religious conflict and discrimination.
So the question becomes, how should a government use that power to stop one group dominating others?
Exactly. And the first, maybe most obvious point the chapter makes is that a state shouldn't be run by religious leaders. It introduces the idea of theocratic states.
Like the old papal states or the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Precisely. Places where there's no real separation between religious institutions and political power. And, well, the track record isn't great, is it?
Not usually, no. Often issues with freedom for minorities, oppression.
Hierarchies, one set of religious rules imposed on everyone. The chapter draws a direct line. If you value peace, freedom, equality, then separating religious and political institutions is pretty necessary.
It makes sense. It's not about being anti-religion, but about creating the right conditions for those values. Like keeping your wiring and plumbing separate, maybe?
Good analogy. You don't want one shorting out the other.
But here's a twist. The chapter then says, hold on, just separating government and religion isn't enough to make a country truly secular.
Right. This is important. You can have states that aren't theocracies but still have really close ties to one particular religion. Think 16th century England and the Anglican Church. Or even today, Pakistan, where Sunni Islam is the official state religion.
Okay, so religious leaders aren't directly in charge, but the state clearly favors one faith.
Exactly. And in those systems, there's still a risk of unfairness. Other religions might be tolerated, maybe, but they're not treated equally in law or public life. Dissent might be limited.
So what's the next step? What makes a state truly secular, according to the chapter?
It's a state that not only avoids theocracy, but also has no formal legal alliance with any religion. No established church, no official faith.
Clean break.
But it goes even further. This is really key. A truly secular state has to be committed to principles and goals that come, at least partly, from non-religious sources,
Like what?
like peace, religious freedom for everyone, including the freedom not to believe, freedom from religiously grounded oppression or discrimination, and equality both between different religious groups and within them.
Okay, so those values are paramount.
Yes. And the separation of state and organized religion is seen as a means to achieve those ends, a tool to promote those values. The exact way you separate them, though, can vary.
Right. Which brings us to different models. The chapter starts with the Western model.
And when it talks about the mainstream Western conception, it's mainly looking at the American model. The key phrase here is mutual exclusion.
Mutual exclusion, like a high fence between 2 yards.
Pretty much. The state doesn't interfere in religion's domain, and religion doesn't interfere in the state's domain. Separate spheres, independent jurisdiction.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, no state policy can have an exclusively religious rationale. You can't base laws just on religious texts. No religious classification can be the basis for public policy. You can't treat citizens differently based on faith.
And funding.
The state can't give financial aid directly to religious institutions generally, and it can't unduly hinder their activities either, as long as they follow general laws.
But what about things happening inside the religion? The chapter mentions this.
Yes, and this is a crucial point of contrast later. In this model, if a religious institution says women can't be priests, or excommunicates someone for dissent, or restricts temple entry, the state tends to stay out.
A silent witness, as the chapter puts it.
Exactly. It views religion largely as a private matter, not the business of state policy or law.
It sounds very individualistic. Freedom of the individual, equality between individuals.
That's a fair assessment. There's less emphasis on community rights or specific protections for minority groups as groups.
And the chapter suggests a historical reason for this.
Yeah, it points out that many Western societies were historically quite homogenous religiously, mainly Christian, with Jewish minorities being the main exception.
So their biggest worry wasn't necessarily conflict between different major religions,
But rather potential domination within the majority religion. Intra-religious issues like church hierarchies or state control over the church. Interreligious equality and minority rights weren't always front and center in the same way.
Makes sense. And this model doesn't really support state-led religious reform either.
Generally not. That principle of mutual exclusion, keeping hands off, means the state isn't supposed to try and change religious practices, even if they seem unfair from an outside perspective.
But then, just to complicate things, the chapter throws in Ataturk's Turkey, a very different Western-inspired model.
Very different indeed. Kemal Ataturk's secularism wasn't about mutual exclusion at all. It was about active state intervention, even suppression of religion's public role.
Yeah, his approach sounds pretty drastic. Abolishing the caliphate, banning the fez, pushing Western clothes, changing the calendar, the alphabet.
It was a top-down, forceful modernization and secularization project. The chapter kind of leaves you wondering, what kind of secularism dictates your clothes or your name.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? Especially when we think about freedom of identity. It really sets the stage for understanding how the Indian approach might be different.
Absolutely. It shows secularism isn't monolithic. So let's turn to the Indian model of secularism.
Yeah.
The chapter immediately tackles that idea that it's just a Western copy.
Right. It says, look closer at the Constitution, you'll see fundamental differences. And it brings in Nehru.
Nehru's vision, yeah. He's presented as the key philosopher here. His idea: equal protection by the state to all religions. Meaning the state shouldn't play favorites, no state religion. Everyone gets equal protection under the law, regardless of faith.
And crucially, for Nehru, secularism did not mean hostility to religion.
Exactly. A sharp contrast with Ataturk. Nehru respected religion's role in people's lives, but at the same time, he didn't believe in that strict American-style separation.
He thought the state could intervene.
Yes, specifically for social reform. The chapter highlights his role in laws against caste discrimination, dowry, sati, and expanding women's rights. The state could step in when religious practices clash with basic equality and justice.
So it's a more engaged approach?
Definitely. And the chapter also stresses Nehru's absolute opposition to communalism, particularly majority communalism. He saw secularism as essential for India's unity, its very integrity.
Not just a principle, but a practical necessity for holding the country together.
Precisely. So Indian secularism's focus goes way beyond just church-state separation. Interreligious equality is absolutely central.
Actively ensuring fairness between religions.
Right. And the chapter digs into the unique history. India had deep religious diversity long before Western ideas arrived. There was already a culture of interreligious tolerance.
But tolerance isn't enough.
That's the key point. Tolerance can coexist with hierarchy, with domination. You can tolerate someone without seeing them as fully equal.
Like saying, I'll put up with you.
Kind of. True secularism. The Indian model aims higher for equal dignity and respect. The chapter argues that Western ideas about equality within and between communities interacted with India's existing diversity to create something unique.
A blend of influences.
Exactly. And this leads to the first big difference from the mainstream Western model. Indian secularism tackles both intra-religious domination, like caste or gender oppression within Hinduism, or discrimination against women in Islam or Christianity, and interreligious domination, the threat of the majority community to minorities. Equally important.
Okay, so it fights battles on two fronts, you could say. What's the second difference?
The second difference is the focus not just on individual religious freedom, but on the freedom of minority communities as well.
What does that entail?
Their right to exist, to maintain their distinct cultures, to run their own educational institutions. It recognizes that individual rights might not be enough to protect group identities in a diverse society.
Got it. And the third difference?
The third is that compatibility with state-supported religious reform. We talked about banning untouchability, child marriage laws. The state can get involved to address internal injustices.
Which seems like a contradiction, right?
Yeah.
How can the state reform religion and still be secular?
It seems like one, but the chapter explains the Indian state's secular character rests on it not being theocratic and not establishing a state religion. Its strategy is more nuanced. It pursues religious equality, sometimes through disengagement, like the U.S. model, and sometimes through engagement or intervention when needed. It's a policy of what the chapter calls principled distance.
Principled distance.
Meaning the distance isn't fixed. The state can engage or disengage depending on whether intervention is needed to promote the core values, peace, freedom, equality.
So it can be hands-off or hands-on, depending on the principle at stake.
Exactly. There's negative engagement opposing religious tyranny, like banning untouchability, and positive engagement supporting minority institutions, for example. The goal is always those core values.
Okay, that clarifies the model.
Or-
But as we know, Indian secularism gets a lot of flack. The chapter dives into the criticisms. First up, it's anti-religious.
Right. And the chapter counters this directly. Secularism opposes institutionalized religious domination, it argues. That's not the same as being anti-religion itself.
In fact, it protects religion.
In a way, yes. By promoting freedom and equality, it protects genuine religious practice. It only undermines the dogmatic, violent, fanatical forms that foster hatred. It targets the distortions, not the faith itself.
Okay. Next criticism. It's a Western import, not authentically Indian.
Yeah, the foreign idea argument. The chapter's response is quite pragmatic.
How so?
Well, first, lots of things in modern India have Western origins: trousers, the internet, democracy itself. Does that make them inherently bad or unsuitable?
Good point.
The crucial thing is whether the idea serves India's own goals. Western states became secular by challenging religious authority. But that specific mutual exclusion model isn't the only way. India evolved its own variant, drawing on both Western ideas and its own long history of coexistence.
So it's adapted, not just adopted.
Exactly. It has its own distinct features and justifications rooted in the Indian context.
Okay, what about minoritism? The charge that it unfairly favors minorities. This one comes up a lot.
It does, and the chapter tackles it head-on. It acknowledges Indian secularism does advocate minority rights, and then asks, is that inherently unfair?
And the justification,
It uses that train compartment analogy, the smoker versus the person with asthma.
I guess.
The fundamental health interests of the minority, the asthmatic, should arguably override the preference of the majority, the smoker. Basic needs trump preferences.
And applying that to communities.
The fundamental interests of minority communities, their right to exist, practice their faith, maintain their culture, need special protection in law, precisely because they are minorities and could be outvoted or overwhelmed by the majority.
The wheelchair ramp analogy also fits here, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Providing a ramp isn't special privilege, it's ensuring equal access for someone with different needs. Minority rights aren't about giving advantages, but about ensuring genuine equality and dignity in a diverse society by addressing specific vulnerabilities.
Makes sense. Then there's the criticism that it's too interventionist, always meddling.
But the chapter argues this misreads the concept of principled distance. Yes, it rejects total exclusion, but that doesn't mean constant interference.
It allows for non-interference, too.
Exactly. The principle guides the decision. And intervention doesn't automatically mean coercion from above. State-supported reform ideally works with progressive elements within the community, not just imposing things.
But it does raise that tricky question. Why haven't the personal laws of all communities been reformed, especially regarding gender equality?
That's a real tension the chapter acknowledges. It's a clash between respecting community autonomy and ensuring individual equality, particularly for women within those communities.
A difficult balancing act.
Extremely. The chapter suggests the path forward isn't coercion or total distance, but the state facilitating reform by supporting liberal voices within religions. A tough task.
Very tough. Okay, now the really thorny one. Vote bank politics. The idea that secularism is just used by politicians to woo specific religious groups for votes.
Yeah, this is a persistent and frankly often cynical criticism. The chapter acknowledges the empirical link politicians do seek votes from communities. That's democracy, in a way.
But is it always bad?
The chapter asks us to consider the purpose. Is the politician just cynically exploiting identity for power, or are they genuinely trying to address the concerns and welfare of that group? If minority votes lead to policies that actually benefit minorities and protect their interests, maybe that's secularism working in a messy, real-world way.
But the danger is huge, isn't it?
Absolutely. The danger is when the welfare of one group is sought at the expense of another, creating new injustices. Or when diverse communities are treated as monolithic vote banks, ignoring internal differences.
And this focus on short-term electoral games.
Can definitely distort priorities, sideline long-term development, and even worsen social divisions. And the whole rhetoric of minority appeasement can backfire, alienating minorities further and hindering internal reform. It's incredibly complex.
It really is. Yeah. Finally, the most pessimistic view. Secularism is an impossible project. Just a utopian dream that can't work in reality because deep religious differences inevitably lead to conflict.
And the chapter pushes back strongly against the cynicism. It points to Indian history itself, centuries of coexistence, however imperfect. And examples like the Ottoman Empire show it's possible, even if past coexistence often involved inequality.
And it argues India's experience isn't an exception anymore.
Exactly. With global migration, increasing diversity is happening everywhere. The world is becoming more like India, in a sense. So India's experiment with secularism, warts and all, isn't some historical anomaly. It might actually mirror the future challenges many societies will face.
So the world is watching India.
In many ways, yes. How India navigates this complex terrain is incredibly relevant globally.
And to get us thinking more, the chapter points to the list of gazetted holidays in India.
Yeah, it asks you, the listener, does this list reflect secular principles? Why or why not? Formulate your own argument.
A good exercise. It also mentions the let's do it and let's think sections, watching films, reading stories, considering specific scenarios to really engage with the ideas.
Encouraging deeper reflection.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into Chapter 8, it's crystal clear that Indian secularism is, well, it's complicated. It's definitely not a simple copy of Western models.
Not at all. Its focus on both inter- and intra-religious domination, its approach to minority rights as community rights, and its allowance for principled state intervention, these make it quite unique, an evolving concept shaped by India's own reality.
It really is. And that leaves us, and you, our listeners, with some final food for thought, doesn't it? Given all these debates, these criticisms, these complexities, what is the future of secularism, not just in India, but globally?
Is the Indian experiment a blueprint? A cautionary tale? Something else entirely? As societies everywhere become more diverse, how do we balance freedom and equality for all?
It's perhaps the crucial question for pluralistic societies moving forward, something to definitely keep pondering.